get us started. Again, welcome to everyone. My name is Richard Mitchell. I'm the Director of Planning and Building. And I'm particularly excited, feel particularly honored and privileged to be a part of this conversation. I grew up here in Richmond, graduated right out of this building here many years ago, and have had the privilege of serving this city now for almost 20 years. Thank you all for coming out this evening. I know late August is very busy. People who have kids and grandkids, you have to get them all situated in school. I remember what that was like. Mine are all grown now, so I don't quite have that headache. But some of you, I think, have been to all of the meetings, all three of the meetings. This is the third one, and we've had various tours in between. We want to thank you for that. And for others, this may be your first opportunity. So again, we want to acknowledge the effort that you are making to participate in public process. This evening you're going to hear from our planning consultants, WR2, and they will summarize the process to date. They will interpret the various concepts and drawings that you've seen. Others have been participating in this process online. This is part of the new era, which allows people to go through Nextdoor and through the website and so on to participate, and so that information has been collected and we'll report it out to you as well. This is a rare moment for many of us. I studied planning and became very, very excited about it, but most of us are born into a place as it is. We've either moved into an existing environment. We've never really had an opportunity to be a part of designing a new village, of creating a new place that would come out of our experience living in places. This happened on a national level about 25 years ago when a group of planners got together up at the Ahwahnee Lodge in Yosemite and wanted to rethink the planning process. Planning had up to that point in the United States been a reactive process. Someone would propose something, somebody in the city would read it and take it forward and say yay or nay. And there wasn't a lot of science put into it. And as a result of that, the residential subdivision model was born in the United States. Now, it played a very important part in our economy following World War II. You had a lot of people coming back from the war and they needed somewhere to live, and so they built the interstate highway system and built houses out as far as you could see, and people eventually began to react to that. They began to question the sustainability of that. We had people commuting into the Bay Area from places like Tracy and so on. So that needed to change, and this group of people came together at Yosemite National Park and began to lay out new principles for planning that call for sustainability, that called for more density, that tried to imitate the characteristics of successful places that we've all seen and experienced. It's kind of like comparing the experience of Solano Avenue in Berkeley and Albany with the experience at a shopping mall where there's a vast sea of parking and sort of cathedral-like buildings out at the edge that you walk into. And people began to do side-by-side comparisons. And so this is a rare opportunity for us to think about making a place, and to make a place based on addressing many of the shortcomings that we've experienced in the places that we've grown up with. Point Molate is a community that once thrived. It's represented today by the prominent structures known as Wine Haven, the cottages that are up along Stenmark Drive. It was born out of the desire by leaders of the influential California Wine Association to create a haven for the making of wine following the major damage that the industry took in the 1906 earthquake. So by 2 years later, they're up at Point Molate, which was a place they found on this remote San Pablo Peninsula to create a community for the making of wine. And it's somewhat ironic that here we are in an area that is now known worldwide for the production of wines, that this cradle of that industry sits derelict today, that the industry is centered up in Napa or down in Pleasanton and so on, but the real cradle of the industry was right there at Wine Haven. And I think that's an important important thing. I'd like to quote something here. In 1994, the publication down in Point Richmond called The Point interviewed two women who were born at Point Molate. One was Virgilia Metzger, and the other was her sister, Helen Forrest. They returned in 1994 to visit the site and to relay their own story. And here's what they said. Their father was a wine chemist, and they said he built a family house up the hill past all the cottages that are there today. The house is no longer there, but the cherry tree that I planted when I was about 6 years old is still there. 5 of us were born at Winehaven, said 75-year-old Helen. Harold, Virgilia, Robert, Victor, and me. I'm the youngest. Mama was midwife to lots of babies. She was the only one in the community who had a doctor book. Life was wonderful then. We swam, rafted, and played along the wonderful beach. No one bothered us. It was safe. We had our own garden. The cooks at the motel were good to us, the hotel, I'm sorry, giving us treats and pies. At the grape juice house, John Miller let us drink all the juice that we wanted to. Their father was also a postmaster there at the facility. I read this in order to remind us of a moment in time when that district was alive and thriving, a place where people lived and worked and where children grew up, a place that lived and thrived. And the hope is that that place can live and thrive again. So tonight, let's approach the discussion with open minds. Let's ask ourselves how an idea might be possible rather than impossible, how a future community might be inclusive rather than exclusive. So the answer to many of the questions about this district should be yes. Will the Point Molate district have open space? Yes. Will the community have and offer unlimited access to the bayfront? Yes. Will the community include a generous network of bicycle paths and trails? Yes. Will the natural habitat be identified and preserved and improved? Yes. Will the community be sustainable? Will the community offer opportunities to kayak, canoe, sail, camp, and go horseback riding? Yes. Will the community be designed to manage sea level rise? Yes. Will the community be inclusive and affordable? Yes. Could the community host multi-generational, multi-income housing? Yes, it once did. Would the community include employment opportunities? Yes. The key is to open our minds to the possibilities and to allow ourselves to think in a very creative and positive manner. And toward that end, I have just wanted to mention a few responses to some of what we refer to as limiting beliefs that people often have that can inhibit sort of free-flowing thought. I know that there's been a lot of conversation about the legal process that led to this conversation. From our standpoint, it is a court order, a judge has signed it, and we must abide by it. It's not a suggestion. So until we are told otherwise, we want to move forward on that basis. Would this new project cost the city money? No, because all new projects have to pay for themselves. Otherwise, cities aren't particularly interested in having them come in. Someone said Chevron offered to buy this land and give it to the regional parks. Well, I was part of the city at that time, and no, that offer was never made. There was an offer to purchase the property and to turn it into refinery buffer zone, to be fenced off. There was never any interest in turning it over to the regional parks. There is no interest at this time from the Chevron Corporation in buying the property. So that was, so let's just understand that one. If Point Molate is developed, downtown Richmond won't develop. Well, that's not true either. It's kind of like saying, well, if we develop out in the Marina District, then there'll be no development in El Sobrante Valley. Developments occur in response to community preference. There are people who would like nothing better than to get up in the morning and take 2 steps and get on a BART train or a Capital Corridor train to go to Sacramento or down to the South Bay. There are other people who would prefer to live in a slightly different setting. It's all about choice and availability. There's no connection between those two. Other bases have closed and been reinvented throughout the region. All of them are in cities that are working on the revitalization of their downtowns, as well as working on figuring out how to use these new available tracts of land. And they all are doing those developments and designs concurrently. One doesn't impact the other. There's a lot of talk about, well, you have to limit development because of limited access. And there again, there's a limiting belief. Who's familiar with Martha's Vineyard, Key West, the islands in Puget Sound, the San Juan Islands? What about Treasure Island in San Francisco? They're preparing 6,000 units there, and that's connected by the Bay Bridge, but it is also connected by the ferry, just as Point Molate may well be. So these are things that what we would urge people to do is to think in terms of what the community would be and leave the constraints to be figured out after the fact. Point Molate is an unspoiled habitat. Well, I think a picture's worth 1,000 words there. There are many elements, many moments in that area where there is something to look at and to preserve. But there's also a great deal of eucalyptus, there's yellow star thistle, there's broom, there's a lot of grading that took place thanks to the Navy. There are rails, there are fences, there are old utility poles, there are old pumping stations and equipment. And so all of that stuff needs to be identified and taken away. So finally, I'd like to ask everyone to participate in this luxury that we have in the United States of speaking our minds, but to do so in a way that is respectful of someone else's point of view. I think what we have here is a freedom, but it also comes with a responsibility. And so what we want to do is to manage our emotions, think and listen, and then respond. And I think that way we can get a lot more said and we can hear a lot more. So with that, I'd like to turn the microphone over to John or Poonam to take us through what our evening is going to be. And again, I want to thank you all for coming, and I think absolutely everyone has something important and worthwhile to say, and I think it will all be captured and reflected in what comes out of this.
Thank you, Richard. That was quite a poetic and eloquent opening speech. That's going to be hard to follow. But I want to welcome everyone again. I'm Poonam Narkar. I'm a senior planner with WRT. Wallace Robertson Todd. We are a consulting firm, interdisciplinary consulting firm providing services in planning, urban design, landscape architecture, and WRT is retained by the city of Richmond to lead this visioning process. It's very nice to see a number of familiar faces here tonight, and also a number of new faces. So welcome everyone, welcome again. We have a long evening ahead of us. We are going to be covering quite a lot of information. And can we get the agenda slide up? So we don't have an official break within the agenda because we want to move through a lot of this information in one go. It's going to benefit from rolling forward like that. And we are hoping to actually end before 9 p.m. so that all of you can get home early. But if you need to get up and stretch, get some food, please feel free to do that at any point during the meeting. We are going to start with a forum that is focused on the infrastructure needs, including multimodal access, the utilities, and to support future uses on the property, potentially shoreline erosion challenges and mitigation, and explore some possible financing models. We have our presenters here, Robert Stevens from Parisi-CSW. Robert is on our team, is on the WRT team, and he is going to be leading the conversation around infrastructure and utilities. We also have here Felicia Williams from Kosmont Companies, and she's going to be covering the discussion around financing models for infrastructure and all the related topics. I would like to welcome our speakers from the city of Richmond. Eric Govan, Fire Marshal, City of Richmond. Chris Castanchoa, Building Official, City of Richmond. Ryan Smith, Director of Water Resource Recovery, also from City of Richmond. And Aaron Weiner, the Area Manager for the Bay Area Veolia in North America. And we have these speakers here who are going to provide some more expert information around the topics that Robert is going to be leading the discussion on. So I would like to welcome our presenters. Just to finish the agenda review, right after this, we are going to do an overview on, for the benefit of those who may be attending a community workshop for the first time, we will be doing an overview of the past events that we have conducted, including the 2 community workshops, Youth Summit, and some of the site tours, and what we heard. And from there, we will be introducing some of the concept alternatives that the team has been exploring. So please welcome our presenters.
Thank you all for being here this evening, and thank you, Poonam, for that great introduction. Again, my name is Robert Stevens, and I'm an engineer with the Parisi-CSW Design Group based here actually in Point, Richmond. And I've had the privilege of supporting the city for quite a few years. I started supporting the city in 2003. And actually I've assessed infrastructure here well before the previous development. So I had the privilege of really touring this site for many years. So, as we know, Point Molate has a long, long history, and the infrastructure that was there was developed for various uses, originally the Winehaven facility and then for the Navy. And it left a lot of great assets that we can build upon as we contemplate future development. One is Stenmark Drive. It's a great asset. We have Interstate 580 that connects us to the rest of the community and the Bay Area. There, of course, is a 12-inch diameter potable water main that's owned and maintained by the East Bay Municipal Utility District. PG&E has a 12,000-volt overhead electrical system, and AT&T has communications infrastructure within the Point Molate area. But in order to develop today, even really limited uses, there's rules and laws we have to follow. The city's building officials and planning officials want to ensure that whatever we produce there is safe for the inhabitants and the users, and that whatever we're doing is we're not causing pollution to the San Francisco Bay Area. And one of the things that the city's fire department, Eric, let me know, is that actually this is a very high fire severity zone. And maybe, Eric, you could talk a little bit about what that means.
Test. Well, if anyone's watched the news the past couple of months, you can tell that the state's burning. So the very high fire hazard severity zone is in the forefront of everyone's minds now. as we're here in the middle of wildland season. But in regards to that specifically for this particular project, it being identified inside the very high fire hazard severity zone, there are certain code requirements, not only from the fire department, but also from the building department that are required to be met to develop anything in that area. So kind of can leave it in general terms in regards to that, but some of those things are building structure, access for our apparatuses, and then anything out there being developed new and refurbished, sprinkler requirements and things of that nature. So just a few topics of some of the challenges that will be faced with this development.
So as Eric mentioned, this is going to drive the need to make sure that Stenmark Drive is designed and is accessible to a current city standard, so fire vehicles can enter and exit, and as well as if there was a need for folks to get out, they'd have the ability to do that. And as Eric mentioned, that fire sprinklers are a big deal. And actually, the fire sprinkler demand that a specific use would need is typically what drives the potable water supply. So it's not the individual water uses that's out there, but it's how much water is needed and what duration of water is needed to fight a fire. Again, the sanitary sewer service is actually managed by Veolia in the city of Richmond. And Ryan, maybe you could talk a little bit about the relationship that Veolia has with the city of Richmond and how that interfaces with the overall sort of planning approvals for developments.
Sure. Veolia is our contract operator for the sanitary sewer system and wastewater treatment plant. They have a long-term contract which now goes through May 2027. And I'm sorry, what was the other part of your question?
So if we develop something there, how does Veolia interact? And if we're going to build new public infrastructure, how does that work?
Right. So anything that we build, they would ultimately operate and maintain for the length of their contract. So that would add, scope of services and an associated cost.
Thank you. So as we mentioned, there's an existing connection Interstate 580, but for folks that might be traveling from Marin to Point Molate, there of course is no exit onto Stenmark Drive. A driver would actually have to go into Point Richmond and actually circulate back towards the off-ramp. Again, any development would have to address stormwater. We'd have to look at a way to control the stormwater that's created on the site, to treat that stormwater before it's discharged to the San Francisco Bay. And then we'd also have to look at electrical service. Even though PG&E has a 12 kV system there could be the potential need to upgrade that. Even if there's a pretty elaborate solar array out there and that power is fed back into the grid, PG&E might have to make some improvements to actually facilitate that. And then there is no natural gas at Point Molate, sorry. So again, here's Stenmark Drive. It's about 10,000 feet long to get from the Interstate 580 to the site. It's currently composed of asphalt. In its current configuration, it doesn't meet the city's standards for the collector roadway of this type. There'd be some basic modifications to widen it to facilitate fire vehicles, as well as to provide Class 2 bicycle lanes on both sides. There'd be the need to realign it in certain locations where there's some sight distance challenges. And like in this photograph here, you can see there's some erosion that's occurring that's blocking the shoulder. And then finally, the Public Works Department would likely want to see resurfacing of the roadway to meet a minimum design life of 20 years to minimize its maintenance needs. So then 580, as we spoke, has some challenges. We all know the congestion that happens there in the morning. And it's exciting. We actually met with MTC, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, last week, and we found out about some of their near-term improvements for the 580 approach. Their goal really is to look at a mode shift. What can we do to actually get folks out of single occupancy vehicles and into either bus or high occupancy vehicles, carpools? What strategies can they implement to create that mode shift? So one of the key goals, the infrastructure improvements they're seeking to make here, is actually to create what's known as it's an open road toll, kind of like when you're traveling on the Carquinez Bridge and you go underneath the overpass, there's no tolls. It's an electronic toll collection system. So this, in effect, would eliminate the toll plaza that's there today. And with that removal, and with a 10% reduction or a mode shift from single occupancy vehicles into high occupancy vehicles, during the peak periods, this yellow sort of represents the decrease in congestion at the interchange. But what that really does because we've actually been asking this question, that if there was a development that was to go on at Point Molate, there would obviously be some really innovative congestion management techniques and really some encouragements for folks to use buses or high occupancy vehicles or potential ferry terminals to actually reduce trips along the corridor. But we asked MTC, what do you think about this? Do you think that really no investment is necessary at the interchange with any level of development out there? And they said, you really should plan for something. And one of the things they mentioned was, if there was a bus or other vehicle that was traveling from Marin to Point Molate, if you removed the actual toll plaza here, you'd actually be able to create a flyover ramp that would actually be able to travel from the eastbound bridge onto Point Molate. It would create the real estate to allow for that movement. Again, many of you might know that the East Bay Regional Park Districts in the city of Richmond is working on the expansion of the San Francisco Bay Trail into the Point Molate zone. It's a Class 1 trail, which basically serves both pedestrians and bicycles. It's 2.5 miles long. It's 10 feet wide of paved surface with shoulders on each side. And many of you might know about the shoreline erosion conditions that are happening. There's some plans to actually are moving forward to actually correct the condition, to prevent the base cause of it, as well as to restore it, the bluff to the 1987 condition. And as we mentioned that today, in 2017, East Bay Mud had a 12-inch diameter potable water line that extended through the corridor. It was constructed in 1997. There used to be a 1 million gallon storage tank on the hill reservoir. That was actually removed in 2017, and we understand it was removed because it was leaking. East Bay Mud has also guaranteed the delivery of at least 864,000 gallons per day of water to the site. So as Eric mentioned, if we are to develop something in this site, we're depending for fire service on the 12-inch diameter water main. And we don't know today whether that line will be able to supply the volume of water necessary to fight a fire should one happen. So the project right now envisions building some sort of a reservoir that's owned and operated by East Bay Mud to facilitate some development in this area. Again, in the existing condition at Point Molate, there is no sanitary sewer infrastructure. The Navy actually had its own wastewater treatment plant and outfall to the bay. That was removed with the transfer back to the city. Currently, existing wastewater collection facilities exist in Point Richmond here. But as you can see, it's quite a distance to get facilities to Point Molate. So Veolia and the city did a previous study to look at if there was an expansion of a wastewater facility to serve this site, it would be a new pipeline of about 15,000 feet. It would include a pump station or two and would require crossing of Interstate 580 here. Potentially also could require securing easements from private property owners to construct this. Again, PG&E does have 12,000 volt electrical service out there. There is communication services. We've been in preliminary discussions with PG&E regarding improvements to their infrastructure. We have actually anticipated an investment, a small investment, to actually serve some development here. We don't know exactly what they need, but we have a placeholder in our estimation right now. So these numbers that I'm going to present are very, very high-level estimates. So if we were to build out just the infrastructure to provide sewer, water, power, improve Stenmark Drive, and do some level of interchange improvements, it could cost something on the order of $100 million to complete. That's a really big number. It's very high level at this point. A couple really important points to make. PG&E, AT&T, and East Bay Mud have only been able to provide limited input because until they know sort of what's contemplated, they won't really put a huge investment in this evaluation. This is the backbone costs. This is the pipes and the wires and all the infrastructure that's necessary to get us into Point Molate. This doesn't include the distribution systems to actually serve buildings. It doesn't include water meter fees. It doesn't have water use fees and all the other things that can sometimes cost a lot. But from a developer's perspective, the backbone costs are usually the difficult issue and the complex thing to ascertain. And this also does not talk about the operating costs that the future users of this community would spend. So then we looked at this from, if we were just basically to look at sort of a really an adaptive reuse of the Winehaven building and maybe something here, maybe we did a restaurant, maybe we did an event center, maybe there was a hotel. And it generated a really modest amount of water use, a modest amount of wastewater use, and it had a fire flow demand. There likely would have to be a pretty large infrastructure improvement to basically be able to provide the fire water supply. And if we looked at it from connecting to the actual city's municipal wastewater collection system, there's a pretty big cost with this. So if you developed 40,000 square feet of area out there, you'd in essence be paying $2,500 per square foot to kind of manage this process, which is a very, very high number. So alternatively, if you looked at this and did the same sort of adaptive reuse, but added the 670 residential units, the water use and the wastewater demand increases, but the pipes that would serve this probably don't increase considerably because the cost really is putting the pipe in the ground. Whether it's a 6-inch pipe or it's a 10-inch pipe, there's a marginal increase, but it's really the cost of actually building this stuff. So because the area increases considerably, the development cost decreases. Now this is not exact numbers, this is just to reflect order of magnitude. So then we looked at it and said, if you did like a very small development and you wanted to do a deep green system, which you took black water or wastewater and you treated it to a tertiary standard and you reuse that water for toilet flushing or mechanical processes or for irrigation, and you created it sort of an internal circulation system, you wouldn't have to connect to the city system. So again, this here depicts, your facility creates black water, goes through a series of filters, treatment systems, and then that water's stored, and then it's piped back into the building for reuse or for potential other resources. And again, this would require treatment to the Title 22 standard in California. But this is a little bit complicated because I guess there's two things, and maybe Ryan, you could help me with this one. So as many of you know, there's some tanks, old fuel storage tanks on the hills. And as we're actually producing this wastewater, this treated water, we were going to reuse it for something. In theory, we could pump it back up the hill and we could rehab these tanks and store this water here, so that in the wintertime, we would be building our storage up. And in the summertime, when we need this water, it could be drawn down back into our buildings and reused. But there's a couple of challenges with that. One, I guess East Bay Mud has the rights to all the recycled water. And then two, the system would actually have to be permitted and operated by Veolia.
permitted through the Regional Water Quality Control Board, and yeah, Veolia would operate and maintain it for the life of their contract.
Because the challenge really is that we're probably going to still produce more water than we can reuse. So at some point, potentially in the winter, we might actually have to discharge some of this water to the bay, which would require a new outfall. So this might have a slightly less lower construction cost, but its operating costs would probably be higher than the traditional city infrastructure. And again, this depicts that condition. You can see that there's essentially, if you assumed you did all the other infrastructure costs and you still were going to do this sort of deep green water reuse, you'd probably reduce about $15 million. And there's a lot of factors that depend on this, but it is a little less cost in terms of capital infrastructure, but the operating cost probably increases significantly. And so we're going to talk about how we're actually going to pay for all this.
Thank you. Do you want questions now? Okay. Thank you, Robert. My name is Felicia Williams. I'm from Kosmont Companies, and we specialize in real estate finance and especially financing large infrastructure projects. And my background is public policy, sustainability, and finance, so that's where I come from in terms of presenting the information. So we're looking at the different financing objectives, and Robert's given a good overview of the infrastructure needs out there. We can understand it's a very high number. But essentially, when we look at development in Point Molate, there are several reasons it can be beneficial for the city. And so that's what we are trying to capture in terms of financing the infrastructure that would go in there as an investment for the city. The critical infrastructure investments are needed for any type of development in Point Molate, and that looks like it's about $100 to $130 million of investments that would be needed in a backbone infrastructure system. And then the financing options, when we looked at our objectives here, we want to look at special districts where the development can pay for itself, and that was also an objective that Richard mentioned, that we didn't want the citizens of Richmond to pay for the infrastructure there, that it should try to pay for itself. Secondly, we want to maximize, there are a lot of state grant opportunities and funding that are available, and a lot of that is because the state is really focused on sustainability, greenhouse gas reduction, and affordable housing, as well as job creation through economic development. So there's several funding sources there that we could also look at to fill in the gap. And lastly, we want to minimize any impact on the city's general fund. Everybody still wants their streets cleaned and their trash picked up, and that's very critical, and so we don't want to impact that in a negative way. So that's what we looked at in terms of financing objectives. Based on those objectives, we are evaluating districts. There's a special districts for financing over there, and this is a summary of the two basic types of districts that we are going to look at. The first one is an enhanced infrastructure financing district. This is new legislation in the state of California that was introduced in 2014. And if many of you are familiar with the redevelopment law, that was terminated in 2012. So EIFDs are one replacement for that. Very different type of structure. It does not allow eminent domain. It does not affect the school districts. There were certain things that were taken out of it that they felt that redevelopment was causing issues with different communities. The second district is a Mello-Roos or community facilities district. You've probably met several people who have homes and they have an annual assessment that they pay to pay for their infrastructure. This is a Mello-Roos district. So the difference between the two, the enhanced infrastructure financing district, there are two big differences between the two. So an EIFD uses the growth in the property value and the property tax based on that That is used to secure bonds to pay for infrastructure. So there is no new tax that is put on those properties. It is the growth in the value of the properties that then generates more property tax. And we'll show a graph of that in a minute. For Mello-Roos districts, that is a new tax. So it's a special tax or an assessment, and that's why when somebody gets their property tax bill, they can see there's a sewer assessment, there's a Mello-Roos district assessment. It is an additional assessment because that infrastructure only benefits that person who has that property. An EIFD, when you look at the use of funds, the investments are for community-wide benefits. So if there is open space out there and the community benefits from that, that is something that the infrastructure district can invest in, and it doesn't just have to be the property owners that benefit from that. The second big difference between the EIFD and the Mello-Roos is that Mello-Roos or community facility districts can pay for operating costs. So when Robert mentions the different systems that will be over there, that is where we have to look at the different districts and say, do we want to pay for operations and maintenance, or do we just want to pay for the investment? And my guess is we'll probably want to do a mixture or a hybrid so that we can cover both. Another difference is the key players and the approval process. One of the things they wanted to change with redevelopment was the voting for redevelopment. When you form an enhanced infrastructure financing district, there is no public vote to form the district. The city council or the county board of supervisors votes and passes a resolution to form the district. When you encumber the district with bonds by issuing bonds, then that requires a public vote. And that is a 55% vote to issue bonds. But you could theoretically form the district, collect the property tax, and never issue bonds, and then it would never go to a vote. The Mello-Roos Community Facilities District requires a vote to form it. So a property owner needs to say, I vote in favor of an assessment on my property tax bill to pay for infrastructure. That's another big difference there. The last area that we looked at is state grants and bond measures, and those are a lot of the park and water bonds that are issued by the state. These would be funds that would be complementary to any of these districts, and they would fill in the gap to the extent that the district did not generate enough revenues to pay for the infrastructure. So here are some case studies. For the Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District, there are only 3 of them in California. So they are very, very new. And they're all very different. They each tell a different story. There are different needs in each community, and so each community did it for a different reason. The best example is West Sacramento Bridge District, and this was a previous infrastructure district that converted over. So this is considered the first one in California, even though it looks a little bit later, but it was a district that converted over. But if you see what they did here is they combined an Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District, a community facilities district, which is an assessment on the property owners that are then moving into that area. And they got significant state grants for sustainability and affordable housing. And they are building all of this out right by the bridge. One of the big expenses was to rebuild the bridge. So that was one of their big infrastructure investments. The next one is San Diego Otay Mesa. And this is one that is very similar to here because it's all vacant land that they're trying to redevelop, and a lot of infrastructure needs to put the development in. And it's an area where they really want to generate jobs and diverse housing options, and it's right by the border, so they really want to take advantage of the border crossings and establish some industries and other jobs that could then support a community in that area. They also need to build fire stations and schools. It's a completely vacant area, so it's a very new development. The last one is the city of Laverne in Southern California. That is a transit-oriented district. As you can see, they're all very different. So this is a new light rail line that's coming into the city, and they want to take advantage of the new mixed-use development that could be put around the light rail station and create connectivity, complete streets, pedestrian amenities, and a connection to the LA County Fair, which is just south of the new station. When you look at all of these districts, there are a few things they do have in common in terms of what they're financing. There's usually a really big push, and so there's the bridge, there is the fire stations and sort of public safety, and then there's the transit. There's actually like a pedestrian bridge that goes into the last project. But a lot of them are utilities, and so that's what we are talking about here. It's not just the street access, but it's the utilities. But all of them are used to fund utilities, because that's usually the largest cost that has to be financed for new development. But in each of these cases, the new development pays for the infrastructure, and it does not, it has minimal impact on the surrounding community. So tax increment financing is what this is called, and that's the basic structure that redevelopment was based on, and the enhanced infrastructure financing district is based on. And tax increment financing was actually passed by the voters in 1952, so it's been around quite a while in California. We've used it in various iterations. But generally, the county collects all property tax payments, and then that's a 1% per Prop 13. 1% is the statutory rate for property taxes in the state of California. So they collect that, and then they feed it out to the cities based on the percentage that the city is allocated. So as you can see, the city of Richmond here receives 28 cents on every dollar that is collected for property tax. That's a very high rate. There's some cities that collect only about 5 cents, but Richmond has a very strong property tax base. And that's one reason why we are looking at these districts. Also, property tax revenues can be used for general purposes by cities, so they are not restricted in what they can use them for. That's another reason why these districts are very popular. So the incremental growth, if you look at the chart here, the base property value is what starts at the bottom, and what we do is we freeze that when the EIFD is formed. Any growth above that, the property taxes associated with that growth then go into the district and then are used to secure bonds. So it is not a new tax, it is that incremental growth, that trajectory that is captured in property taxes. And that just sort of describes sort of how that process works a little bit. But it is a separate fund that this money needs to go into, because it needs to secure bonds, and the bondholders need to know that they are going to be paid. So the different taxing entities that can participate, school districts cannot participate in EIFDs. That was one of the challenges with redevelopment, as it really impacted the school districts negatively. So they were removed from these districts. The city of Richmond, Contra Costa County, the East Bay Regional Park District, and also BART can participate and contribute a portion of either property tax or other tax revenues to the district to support the infrastructure. So that is it for the financing districts that we are looking at. The process would generally be, once the land use alternative, preferred alternative is developed, we would look at the square footages and then calculate the projected property tax to be generated. One of the issues is that Point Molate collects no property tax now, so anything that comes from there is growth, and that's also a great thing as well, because there's a lot of growth potential there. So once we come up with the projections of property taxes that could be generated, the city would come up with a resolution that would go before the city council to determine how much to contribute to that district. We could also then go to Contra Costa County, ask them for a portion of their property tax increment to contribute. And whatever the gap is, we would look for alternative financing sources like grants or a community facilities district to complement that. So that is it for my presentation. Thank you.
Yes, so this is a time for question and asking questions to our speakers here. I'm going to run around with a mic.
Hi, in terms of the financing, it's my understanding that a Mello-Roos bond has a limited time span, that it can't be longer than 30 or 40 years. Is that accurate? In which case, that means that the long-term costs of maintenance of any infrastructure out there would flip back to the city at that point. Is that accurate? And also, in terms of the Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District, does it also have time limiting in that regard? And do you have any ideas of how long it would take to repay over $100 million in infrastructure investments, or, you know, through this scheme, through simply relying on property tax revenue increases from Point Molate?
Sure. So the answer is that all of these districts do have a time frame on them. The community facility districts is about 40 years. And generally, they issue 30-year bonds. That's the usual structure for municipal bonds. So generally, you would take the $100 million and you would finance it over 30 years. Going longer than that is it's a little bit difficult because investors wouldn't feel comfortable going out that far in terms of projected interest rates. So you would take that and you would do it over 30 years. So it wouldn't be sort of how long would it be to pay it off. You would sort of structure the payments just like a mortgage so that they would be a certain amount each year. The Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District is 45 years after the bond is issued, and they extended that for that reason, to try to, so you could issue different series of bonds. So if you issue the first bond, then you do the next bond. After 45 years, you basically have about 15 years to issue 30-year bonds, because you could do 2 or 3 bond issues within that.
So just to be super clear for everybody in the room, it means that at the expiration of either of these bond schemes, the total cost for support of ongoing infrastructure support reverts to the taxpayers of the city here, correct?
So, well, it would revert to, there are a couple ways you could do it. One is you could have a prepaid service contract for a certain amount of time that the Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District could pay for, or secondly, you would renew the district. So you might be seeing a lot of the landscape and lighting maintenance districts, which is very popular. They renew them so that they can continue to pay for operations and maintenance expense. Okay. Instead of it transferring to the rest of the citizens.
And in terms of the grant funding opportunities that you highlighted, you talked about green strategies, transportation hubs, ABAG funding. It's my understanding that the fact that the city of Richmond is proposing to leapfrog over all kinds of development opportunities that are much more closely located to existing infrastructure now, and especially transportation infrastructure, to engage in the kind of sprawl development that is generally looked down upon by ABAG and by states' planning forces. Wouldn't that be detrimental to any plans for getting grant funding along those lines?
I don't know that would be detrimental. This is also a settlement and a judgment, which is very different than the city choosing to go out there. I just want to make sure that people understand. Mm-hmm. It's a settlement where housing was negotiated as an element of it. In fact, housing would have never been a product had the litigation gone forward. So in fact, it was a choice by the mayor and the other parties who negotiated for the city to put housing on the table and go down this area. So just to clarify that.
Okay, sure. So we have had these conversations in the previous workshops too, and I think there has been a response from the city explaining that.
Yeah, I think your basic question was that, is this a step to kind of step over development in downtown and develop out at the edge, which is inconsistent with infill development and so on? No, because our sites, we're not preventing development of sites in downtown Richmond. All these sites we've already done zoning, high-density zoning, infill zoning, to make it possible to develop all of the sites in downtown. But this site is also looked at as an infill site, in that this site is inside of the Bay Area Bowl, okay? It's not Tracy, it's not Mountain House. It is inside of the Bay Area Bowl next to existing transportation systems. So it is considered an infill development site by ABAG. Okay, yeah, sorry.
Hello, there we go. A couple of questions. The PG&E lines that are out there now, I'm presuming they're above ground, and is the vision moving forward that the lines would remain above ground, or is there any discussion about underground lines? And then also the Melrose financing scheme. It says the property owners have a vote even if they don't live in Richmond, correct?
So yes, the overhead lines are on poles today, and my understanding, similar to other developments, would be that it would be undergrounded in the future.
Sure, and the property owner, regardless of where they reside, would be the one voting on the bonds for a district and then voting on the assessment for a metal roofs.
Couple hands on this side.
So, great presentation. From what I understand is that this is a self-funded project, and the benefits to the community, and this includes other areas of Richmond also, will be increased property tax, more people living, and so an enhancement to the patronage of local businesses and economic vibrancy, vitality, sort of like a kickstart to it. And it is a self-funded project through all of the means that you mentioned. And we can still have open space for kayaking because like 80% is still available. So I just wanted to make sure that my understanding is correct, which is that this is going to be beneficial to the city because it's going to give us additional tax revenues, and it's going to be self-funded. And we'll be able to get everything that we want in terms of walking parks and trails and water sports, etc.
So that's a little bit like a Christmas list. I hope that is the case. But what we are going to do, it's basically a cost-benefit analysis that if the amount of new development is limited in Point Molate, then that will mean fewer revenues to pay for what seems to be very basic infrastructure is about $100 million. So if you have fewer units there, if you have fewer commercial entities there, then you will have less to pay for that development, and then that's where it would spill over into the citizens of Richmond paying either from the general fund or from property taxes or sales taxes. And so that will be a decision that the city needs to make in conjunction with the community. How much development, what is the preferred alternative? How much does that fund? How much can we fill in the gaps? And then how much is the community willing to pay to have certain types of open space and other recreational opportunities out there? And so we're going to do our best to have it fund itself, but it will depend on what the final alternative is for land use out there.
I have two questions. My first question is for Mr. Weiner, and my second question is for you, Ms. Williams. Mr. Weiner, you sent a letter to the mayor in 2015, and you had estimated it would be $15 million for the pump station at the historic district, at the second pump station on the other side of the bridge, and then the pipe in between that. How is it going from 15 million to 40 million so quickly?
That's a very good question.
Thank you.
The estimate that I provided, which is a very high-level 3-year-old estimate, was 15 million, and there was a separate estimate for work that needed to get done potentially at Keller Beach. So there may be a fudge factor that somebody added onto that number.
But the Keller Beach is already funded. That's like 5.6 million, and that's already been budgeted from a previous project that affects a lot of things outside Point Molate, doesn't it? Okay, that's fine.
So I can help answer that. So the basis for the cost is actually Veolia's original estimate. It includes all of the other infrastructure that needs to be improved in Point Richmond that to date hasn't occurred as I understand it. I'm correct in that?
So if you're talking about Keller Beach, then yes.
Right. So that's included in there. And also that cost estimate has been escalated for 4 years.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is that $100 million includes other improvements for other areas of Richmond outside of Point Molate, and you've thrown that all on top of it to inflate the figure of what the infrastructure costs are for Point Molate itself. Is that correct?
It includes everything to create a sewer system to serve that site, plus inflation from 2015 to 2018.
But much of that's already funded, isn't it? I mean, a lot of that are projects that were voted on, or there were sewer fee increases in 2010 and 2015, which covered a lot of those things already that you're talking about.
The rate increase that went into effect about 3 years ago, and we'll have the last rate increase next July, that was to fund the debt service for needed treatment plant improvements and sewer projects to comply with the Baykeeper settlement agreement.
All right. And Ms. Williams, my question for you is, I just want to do some math on the back of a napkin. So if you built 670 houses out there, and someone's already given an estimate that the city's portion of the property tax for each of one of those units would, going just to the city, not including other property taxes, would be about $2,700 per year. Okay, so if you multiply that 670 houses by $2,700, you get about $1.8 million. So the infrastructure you say is $100 million, plus there's interest on the bonds, which would probably bring it to like $180 million. So the math that I see is that it would take about 100 years for those residents to pay for their infrastructure and their interest on the infrastructure, whether it's an EIFD or a CFD, and that it would be over 100 years before any of the taxes generated at Point Molate would actually be free to serve other services outside of Point Molate. Does that sound about right to you? Or my math can't possibly be right there.
So that's, if it's only residential that's being built out there, then that would probably be close to the case. But if you look at the alternatives, and there are other commercial enterprises there, those commercial enterprises generate sales tax, employment tax, other taxes that can support
but to summarize, generally, if you capture every penny of property tax that these 670 homes pay, it will take about 100 years to pay for their own infrastructure and the interest on that infrastructure.
I don't think the numbers are correct.
Okay, but you're saying they're close to correct. I mean, because I'm only giving you rough estimates.
No, there's also escalation, because property taxes, as we all know, they go up every year.
Right, 1%, you get 1% of that, so that's
2%.
Okay.
No, they go up 2% a year.
Okay, so that's $27
Then when properties
a house.
sell, they get reassessed. So I don't agree with your numbers, and what we're going to do is, once we do get accurate land use values, then we can run numbers, and those will be presented.
Okay, thank you.
With the highest part of the cost being the 580 connection, did anyone look at the infrastructure coming in from the east, from Richmond Parkway? And did anyone evaluate what the cost of that might be? And second part of that, I know we're looking at North Richmond as an area of interest for Richmond, so would there be any possible grants or whatever that might be associated with that that may also help with the infrastructure coming this direction?
So maybe you could, as I understand, circulating some other way through the Chevron facility, is that what you were asking?
Heading towards Parr or Gertrude or Point East.
Right, so I think that's a really good point. There's no city-owned property, and as I understand, I believe that's all owned by Chevron. So there's the potential to do that, but there'd be a large land acquisition cost and other issues associated with doing that. So I think it's an interesting alternative to consider, but I think in the end it would be pretty considerably costly to do that. And I think one of the interesting things we learned is that MTC is sort of interested in, if there really was a project here and there really was a funding source to do something at the interchange, there might be some regional funds available, because there's things that are greater, there's greater issues at the approach than just this, and they might be willing to invest additional funds.
Thank you. I had a few questions too. One was, and this is pretty simple, yes or no. There was, is this working? Okay, thanks. There was a mention on the EIFD funds that if the city council approves, they can go and issue a bond with or without putting it to a vote. Was I wrong in that?
The district can be formed without a vote. It's a city council resolution. All bonds require 55% voter approval.
Okay, so the entire city would have to vote.
It would be the property owners and voters located within the district only.
That's not just for Melrose?
No.
So that special district, so the city can't levy a bond or spend any money on the Point Molate of the taxpayers of Richmond's already. There can't be any extra bond that any of us would have to pay without being put to a vote.
Not associated with the district. There are other types of bonds, general obligation bonds, lease revenue bonds, those sorts of things that would not be associated with the district. General obligation bond would require approval from the voters. But for a district specifically, only the members and the property owners within the district vote on those bonds.
But it all could be put into the same pot, like you're putting Point Richmond sewer in with Point Molate sewer. It can all be put into the same, we need to upgrade the sewer pot.
Well, if the EIFD is formed, the revenues have to be separated.
Okay.
As well as the infrastructure projects. So if those revenues are going to go to those infrastructure projects, you could only have them be from that account.
Okay, so another thing, question I had, since half the cost of the $100+ million, and then you mentioned $140 million, was the 580 reconstruction, how likely is that to happen, and what kind of timeline?
In the estimate, it's a placeholder of $35 million for some sort of interchange improvement there. It's totally unknown what that could be. We looked conceptually at something from when you're heading eastbound from the bridge, if you wanted to get off and go down Stenmark Drive, we looked at some sort of an improvement there. It really depends on a lot of factors. It really depends on what land use is proposed. Again, this is sort of something of regional significance, so I could see a lot of other parties kind of help shape what that final improvement is.
Okay, because it seems like it would mostly benefit the 11,000 houses or something, 1,100 houses or something in Point Molate.
But there could be, so as I understand it, the Caltrans has some issues with some right-of-way challenges going through there. So there could be some overall improvements there that could enhance access through it.
That's Chevron too, isn't it?
Partially Chevron and partially the city.
Okay, great. One of the estimated costs, you were talking about the alternative kind of green local sanitary treatment sewage, and you said it would cost so much because Veolia would cost so much to run it, and they have the contract. No?
No, the issue is that Veolia would be responsible for managing its operations.
And that would be, why would that be so high?
It really just boils down to operating, maintaining a pipeline or operating, maintaining a complicated wastewater treatment plant. And treatment plants are far more expensive to operate and maintain than a pipeline, whether it's Veolia or city staff.
Okay. And finally, you're talking, I mean, part of what I'm thinking of, if you do all this and spend all this money and have a special assessment, this is going to be pretty high-end housing. And the 1997 reuse plan says this is going to be high-end housing because of the high-value waterfront And because of the high cost of infrastructure, it's not going to be affordable housing. This is going to be expensive housing. In order to get enough money back to pay for all this, is that being considered at all when you consider this mixed-use vision of mixed classes, mixed economies?
I think it comes down to there's a sweet spot of land uses and density that economically works to pay off whatever the infrastructure costs are necessary there.
I read the EIR that was written in, I think, 2009. It was about 10 years old, and it was based around the casino, where there was no construction anywhere but around Winehaven, where they were going to do the casino. And they considered traffic, but of course that always has to be updated if it's 10 years old. And the EIR did not at all consider the effect on the south slope and the effect on the eelgrass beds. Is there going to be a new EIR performed?
I think the answer to that is that if there was a project defined, there would be a CEQA process and an environmental document completed.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to move on to other speakers, and we'll come back to you. We have a couple hands over there.
Thank you. Got to get used to these mics. A couple quick questions. Is the forum going to present anything on the cost of city services? What the impression I'm getting from the questions, 670 houses is going to be very difficult to fund $100 million in infrastructure. So is there any information going to be given on the costs of city services, police? This is a remote location, fire, school, emergency services.
So this analysis is just the backbone infrastructure to get stuff to the site to serve the site. All the things related to the development, I think, would be handled through standard impact fees and other assessments that would be evaluated during the environmental process. And I think, like any other typical development project, the development would be responsible for paying for those.
Okay, and just a quick follow-up. My impression was from the earlier workshops that we would be getting a traffic capacity analysis. That's been an issue that has been brought up in the council level by some council members, a lot in the public, by the very fact that going to the workshops, we've often sat in traffic on Saturdays, just trying to get out to the site. That's not even a weekday. So is there going to be any information provided to the public on a traffic capacity analysis?
Yes.
And when will that be?
So the vision document includes, these are conceptual land use alternatives, right? The traffic analysis and traffic impact analysis is going to be a much later stage when there are final land uses done. So it's more of a future phase of the project.
The one point I'd make to that is the actual Stenmark Drive is not the bottleneck for most anticipated uses. Of course, it's the interchange.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then just real quickly, the RFQ originally from the planning department to the developers that actually occurred as the planning process for the public was starting mentioned a 5-lane highway at Stenmark. Is that actually being considered?
Hi, I'm Lena Velasco, Planning Manager. So that was in the original draft that we provided the City Council, but we took that out. So the final that was issued to developers, that language was stricken.
So just the casino EIR with 1,100 houses had widening of Stenmark, which also I think included taking part of Point Molate bluff away, and widening. Is that so? Widening, what would this mean under this infrastructure proposal?
Well, we haven't done the traffic generation yet, and we won't be able to do it until a project is more solidified. But the casino alternative included the casino, the conference center, the hotel, the 1,100 residential units. So it was more than just the 1,100 units that generated that much traffic.
Thank you.
Yes.
Just wanted to address one of the questions from a few minutes ago about who was going to vote on these taxes. Now, I'm not that bright of a guy, so I need a little help on trying to explain this to me. You're trying to say that the property owners and the residents get to vote on this. This is one of those chicken and the egg kind of situations. You need all this infrastructure in place, which means you need to have a vote before the residences are built, before the businesses are built. So who exactly is going to be voting on this before any of the property changes hands? Is it just one person, the city, since they own the property?
So the district is formed without a vote. This is the infrastructure district. Generally 5 to 7 years later is when you issue the bonds, because there usually isn't enough money up front to issue bonds. So after 5 to 7 years, the property owners that would be there after 5 to 7 years would be the ones to vote on that. And so you would create a district boundary that would include those residences or different uses that you have there. For the Melrose district, it would be the property owners. So if a developer purchased it or if the city owned it, then it would have to be the new properties that went in. You wouldn't form the Melrose district until the properties were in and you had the property owners.
Don't you have to have the infrastructure in place before?
So that's actually the chicken and egg problem that we are looking at, is that a community facilities district can fund infrastructure up front, and EIFD is about 7 or 10 years out. So when you look at some of the infrastructure, either the EIFD would repay some sort of bond or loan that was issued first, but it would 7 to 10 years is generally the time frame when you would be issuing the bonds, because there isn't enough tax increment in the beginning. It has to build up over time. And so at that time when it's built out is when those property owners would be voting.
Hi. I have a question and a request. The request is, I think in the slide titled Infrastructure Development Costs, I think there were 2 slides. If you would just briefly pop the 2 up. But my question is for our fire department. As you well know, the Hayward Fault has, I think it's a 70% chance of a major earthquake within the next 30 years. And if things go really badly, you could be looking at Chevron blowing up. You're going to have one road, and all these people who live out there, as well as everybody else in the city of Richmond who's going to need your help. Could you comment on the disaster scenario that you can imagine out there under those circumstances?
At this point in the game, it's hard to analyze any of that until you actually see what's being proposed, and then once that final proposal is in place, then we can assess it appropriately. Otherwise, we can play the what-if games all night. Well, access would be one of the immediate, how do we get in there, you know what I mean, depending on fault lines and everything else. So that's one off the top that is a given. Yeah. Again, all that is something that would have to be in place once that final proposal is in place. Again, I can play the what if, but the access that's to and from. Us getting in and us getting you guys out. So again, that's something that can't really be analyzed and pinpoint until it's an approved, developed plan.
Just a quick question. With the parameters of the bond, are there any legalities around affordable housing, or are there any requirements for, let's say, a percentage of the 670 to have to be affordable housing?
So with the EIFD and the Melrose District or the bonds associated with those districts, there is no affordable housing requirement. There is a different type of legislation called a community reinvestment investment authority, and that's a CREA. It is the sister to the EIFD, and that has a 20% affordable housing requirement in it. The reason why we are not looking at a CREA district here is because you have to have certain crime rates, poverty rates, and other unemployment rates that characterize a district for it to be qualified. And since there isn't anyone who lives in Point Molate, it can't be qualified as a CREA district. So that's why we didn't look at that district.
We have time for 2 more questions, one on this side and then one on this side.
Hi, these are quick questions, I think. One is the question as to why there's only one road going in there. That seems totally crazy to me. Someone spoke of easement in order to get the sewer over to the treatment plant in Point Richmond. Can't there be an easement through Standard Oil property from the north? That's one question. And number 2 is, who owns that land that you spoke of needs an easement to get, it was either the sewer or the road over to the 580?
So yes, as we discussed, there could be an alternative to construct a secondary access point through the Chevron property, and I think it's a good study to look and see what the costs would be necessary to do that. I think, again, acquiring an easement for a road is significantly larger than acquiring a small easement for a sewer. As I understand it, the sewer easement's required also in Chevron property, but it's a fairly narrow corridor and a fairly short corridor.
And they're not using the land for anything else. Why would they fail to give us an easement?
I can't answer that.
They might if there was no housing going in. They're opposed to housing, but if it was for recreational use, they might be a lot more cooperative.
Well, I'm thinking that when we give up oil and Chevron gives up the land, we'll have a lot more options.
One last question.
Thank you. 2 quick questions. The 35 million number for the 580 interchange, you mentioned that MTC and Caltrans are very excited about this as a possibility. Are they talking any numbers or money or financing that they're exploring to kind of support this project if it's a priority area for this project? And then the second question for Ms. Williams, the kind of establishing what are the priorities in terms of the financing. If you could go back to that slide, and if you could share a little bit about your processes, how you came to decide on those specific aspects, people you've spoken to in the community, demographics of people you've spoken with, how you set those benefits and priorities specifically, that'd be great. Thank you.
So first off, Caltrans and MTC were interested in finding out more about this project. I wouldn't characterize them as being excited about it, but they'd like to understand more about what we're proposing to do and to see if there's any mutually beneficial things that could make it better for everyone.
Sure, and the priorities that we developed were based on initial discussions with city staff. So if there are other priorities that you have, I'd love to talk to you about them in terms of, and these are the priorities that the communities that are looking at this, there are about 24 communities looking at this in California. Those are their standard priorities, so we'd love to customize them for Richmond. Well, the benefits are taken from the Point Molate website, so that's sort of the general benefits of the development at the top. The priorities for the funding were developed with city staff, and we'll continue to work with them to develop other priorities.
So if we looked at this and we said we're going to do some form of adaptive reuse, we still have to provide some form of wastewater treatment. And that wastewater treatment system is not going to be cheap. We still probably have to provide a reservoir, and we probably have to upgrade portions of the East Bay Mud Water Pipeline. That's not going to be a low cost either. I mean, there's probably $20 to $25 million. There's a floor. It's not $5 million. It's something significant. It's not $100 million, but it's not $5 million. Yes, that's true.
Sorry, we're going to have to keep rolling through the agenda so that we can cover a lot more information that we have to share here tonight. I want to thank all of our panelists and speakers here for answering the questions and providing very valuable information. Thank you all for actually a great participation. I know that we were not able to respond to all the questions. Robert will be here for the rest of the evening, and we will have time at the end of the agenda. If we are able to get through the rest of our information sooner, then there will be a Q&A time period at that time then as well. And Felicia, are you around for a little more? Yes, so Felicia and Robert will be here. The rest of our speakers will be leaving, but if you have comments that you would like their responses on, please send those comments to us through our project website, or you can send an email to Lena, and we will try to get you the responses as soon as we are able to. Thank you. Okay, so moving on, we wanted to sort of just summarize what the process that we have been through this in the last couple of months since the community visioning process was launched. It's been a pretty busy summer, and there have been 2 community workshops, a youth summit, 4 site tours, 3 special topic forums, including the one that we did tonight, and 3 to 4 pop-up events to reach out to a broad and diverse community base. Tag teaming both with the consultants and the city staff have been working very closely to reach out to as many community members as possible. And our digital engagement platform has been up for the last 2 months. It has we have been able to reach over 100. We've been able to reach actually several of hundreds of people, and we have received input from over 100 people on the activities that are currently up on our project website. To quickly summarize the basis for the visioning process, this slide actually lists the past planning efforts which have formed and form the basis for the current visioning process, and these documents are very relevant to what we are, to the process that we currently are in. The most recent one being the judgment that was passed in April of 2018, which has very specific requirements, is an important and key document and guidance for this process as well. This graphic this graphic illustrates what the reuse plan from 1997 was recommending as far as the development areas versus the open space was. The reuse plan suggested a ratio of 70% open space versus 30% developable areas, and it is also something that the judgment requires this process to follow. Yeah, we will. I think, yeah, for tonight, let's just not get into the same conversations over and over again. There's not going to be a consensus on everything in this room tonight, so let's just flow with things so that we can move along. The technical team did some analysis on our own. We looked at very important site-level information, such as steep slopes. We looked at riparian corridors, sensitive habitat areas, and special status species locations. And then we looked at this very complex habitat map, which actually illustrates the number of different sensitive habitats that are on the property. And the reason that these three are really, some of the key analyses, because they are very important as far as any future site planning is concerned. They are going to form the fundamentals for some of the the concept alternatives that you're going to see later tonight. Based on this analysis, we as the consultant team, we took a stab at actually refining the development areas that were identified in the 1997 reuse plan, because now we are better informed about the challenges and constraints and sensitivities on the site, and we have very consciously responded to those when we started to identify what the development areas could potentially be. So you will see that there is this shrunk from what it was previously, which was a much larger area that was identified in the reuse plan, but there is there's the riparian corridors and sensitive ecology in this area, and we then shrunk the footprint of this development area. But it also opened up, we looked at opening up the flat point as a potential location for development, because this part of the site has already been what we can call as disturbed, because it was graded by the Navy, there was activity that was already happening, so it's not pristine in any shape or form, nor are there any high-level ecologically sensitive sensitivities in this point. So this is the base map that we introduced at the last community workshop. So leaving it here, I'm going to then just quickly also, I want to summarize what we have heard so far through the number of activities that we have conducted in the last 2 months. I will say that it's really commendable how much participation we have seen from the community in the last 2 months over summer. Summers are very busy times. Usually people are on vacation. It's a time to sort of enjoy and relax, but we made you work a lot by calling you to come and join us every 4 weeks, every 2 weeks. We had a lot of participation at the first community workshop. We saw around 200 people. We had close to anywhere from 60 to 80 people on the site tours that we conducted. We had 50 youth join us for the youth summit, and even at the last workshop, we saw about 100 people. So that's a really you're an engaged community. That's a good sign. What we heard on during the first community workshop, we did a very broad visioning. There was a site tour followed by a visioning discussion, and what we heard from the community were basically a lot of really good ideas that represent good planning principles. There was we heard a lot about habitat protection and restoration. We heard about being environmentally responsible. We heard about social equity by providing multi-modal access, by addressing transportation needs, addressing infrastructure needs. We heard a lot about open space and recreation, the need for providing access to wide public access to the open space by providing hiking trails, camping, kayaking, and a number of recreational facilities that are open to the broader community. We heard also about historical, protecting the historical and cultural resources, the core historic district, as well as the cultural resources that are on the property. Also, there was a very strong feeling about making this an economically and financially feasible project by making sure that there are economic drivers that are not a drain on cities' resources, but actually, as we talked here earlier, it's a much more self-supporting, self-funding type of project, and it actually provides benefits to the community over the longer term, and not vice versa. And along with that, we heard a really wide range of potential programs and uses that the community would like to see on the property. Yeah, what Richard was talking about, Point Molate being a living and thriving community in the past. And how can that be continued? How can Point Molate continue to be a living and thriving community? We actually did hear quite a bit from the younger generation, as well as from a pretty diverse group of people, including the youth at the Youth Summit, is that they would like to see an inclusive, intergenerational community, a sustainable community, really wanting to see social equity through the uses that are provided there. So some of the uses that came up were public art, community facilities, commercial office, and offices, maybe small offices for incubator businesses, for entrepreneurs, for residents of Richmond who don't have to leave the community to start a business of their own, but can actually be in their community and continue to stay there by having these facilities available to them. A lot of, sorry, I'm not able to read everything. We also heard actually about a lot of openness for hospitality and conference facilities and meetings to help support some of the the goal of having some economic drivers and housing. People. There were a lot of different ideas about what types of housing could go here, live-work units, dense, there was some people expressed preference for denser housing so that it fits on a smaller footprint and leaves more open space. And again, making inclusive village, affordable housing, as well as transitional housing for homeless. So again, everything that we heard just really pointed us to the fact that this needs to be a mixed-use, inclusive type of community on Point Molate. A month later, we had a youth summit where we had about 50 youth from the city of Richmond that joined us. They got a site tour. Most of them had been to the site for the first time, and we had them engage in a number of different activities and went through the same visioning process to hear what they would like to see on the property as part of their future. How would they like Point Molate to evolve with them as and become a part of their future life? And we heard a lot about having the desire for youth-oriented facilities and youth-oriented activities, including some educational and institutional facilities. Just some clips from the site tours. As I said, there were 4 site tours that were conducted, and this was a great opportunity for people, for the community members to actually go and experience the site and visualize what can happen here in the future and really understand some of the challenges and constraints and sensitivities that we have talked about earlier. On July 25th, a month from today, a month ago, we had the second community workshop, we also had two special topic forums during that workshop. We talked about public open space, and we had speakers from Trust for Public Land, from East Bay Regional Parks District, from National Park Services, Coastal Conservancy, and all of them, all the speakers talked about, how there is a potential for different kinds of partnerships that the city could get into with some of these agencies. There are some agencies that are going to be much more natural partners to work with the city on public open space, and then there are others that sort of are available to provide expertise and advice, but that is not necessarily this may not necessarily be the type of project that they as an organization undertake because of their mission and operational logistics. Following the two forums, we had a hands-on activity with which a number of you participated in. We had a scaled base map, and there were some what we called as game chips, which were scaled, and those colored chips basically represented the different uses. So it was we provided the ingredients, and we asked people to come up with a recipe for the kind of community they would like to see on Point Molate. And we had 10 groups that worked together. There were anywhere from 4 to 6 participants per group. We had to talk to each other. We had to not necessarily agree with each other, but we had to find a way to work together to come up with a vision for Point Molate. And there wasn't, I will not say there was consensus on everything, and that was not the point. There were definitely topics where there was consensus, and there were other topics where there was partial agreement. Some groups agreed on certain things, and others did not agree with them. We also had actually game rules, and the game rules were that the requirements of the judgment needed to be fulfilled as we were playing the game. And the requirements of the judgment were, yes, we are respecting the 70-30% ratio of open space to development areas. We're preserving the core historic district, including Building 6, and we had to provide a minimum of 670 residential units. These rules came directly from the judgment. They were not made up by anybody else, so these rules had to be followed. Again, not all teams followed the rules, and you can see that in this. Which was fine for that purpose, but we have to, moving forward as part of this process, these are the givens, and we do have to work within that framework of what the judgment requires, what the judgment requirements are. This is the range of different ideas that came up through the discussion, and these were the three. You will see that I think there are 6 out of 10 that provided some level of housing. Of the 6, not all 6 met the judgment requirement of a minimum of 670 units. So they broke their rules also, but they partially followed the rules, but then they decided to break the rules, which is okay. This actually represents the range of approaches to housing on Point Molate that came out of that process. There was, some minimal level of housing to fulfill some housing requirements, mainly here in around Building 6 and a little bit here where the old cottages are. And then there was this one, which was a lot of housing on the drum lot, on the point, and also in the historic district. And then this one was kind of in the middle of these two ends of the spectrum. So we just wanted to represent that here in terms of the range that we saw at the last community workshop. What we did, we collected all of this information and we took it back and we processed it and tried to, the one thing I do want to say here also is that although rules were broken and not all the requirements were fulfilled, we still got a lot of useful feedback and very valuable feedback from the community. Because other than housing, there are a number of other uses that need to take place on the property, and what can those uses be? That was also really important for us to hear from the community in terms of what different uses and what mix of uses can we actually consider on the property, and we heard a lot about those too. So we summarized, and this was our attempt at sort of organizing the feedback that we received in the categories that then forms the basis for how we explored the land use concepts after this workshop. As you can see here, all the solid greens represent the area, represent the topics that where we saw consensus. Protection of the eelgrass, protection of the hillside habitat areas in the hillside, the riparian corridors, some of the sensitive areas on the bluff here. All of these were areas of consensus, and then there wasn't necessarily a strong agreement along this, but it was significant enough that we needed to represent it here as something to consider around the shoreline. Parks and recreation. Around this topic, we definitely heard a lot about access to water in the form of kayaking, in the form of water taxis to be used as potentially as transportation, recreational access, recreational, water sports and things like that. Camping, glamping, and hiking trails. These three were identified as potential locations for active recreation or sports fields. So, some groups thought it would be great to put sports fields here. Others felt there were these other two areas that could work. So we are representing all three here as a summary of what we heard. Historical and cultural resources. Strong agreement on saving, protecting, and actually having adaptive reuse of the historic Wine Haven building and the old hotel. And some of the ideas for adaptive reuse that came up were, again, a hotel, a lodge, conference center, maybe educational facilities, performing arts, art galleries, retail, restaurant, live work units, offices, and even residential. And these two areas, there was, again, some people did not feel very strongly that these areas need to be protected. They felt it was okay to maybe take them down and rebuild those sites. Circulation. A lot of interest in having potentially maybe a ferry or water taxis. Really strong support for connecting to the regional transit, establishing shuttle services and making sure that there are bus routes that connect to regional transit system. Bay Trail, making sure that the Bay Trail is connected, Bay Trail functions as additional access, and then a lot of concern over this interchange that we heard earlier this evening too. This was definitely an area where there wasn't consensus, and but as we saw from the pictures of the board games that a few slides ago, some of the areas that different groups explored, where if they had to put housing, where would they put it? They might put it here, 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 or here. So that was a good starting point. That was good direction for the team to consider, knowing that for us, we have to work within the constraints of the judgment, and we had to test where the housing would be located. We actually did take these very, very seriously, and we explored these locations for housing. And then putting it all together, this was really interesting, because what this tells us is that it's possible to actually have something of everything when we put it all together. And how are we going to have something of everything? That is the question, and the key question to be answered, because to have something of everything, we have to find the right balance to make the recipe that's going to be flavorful, which has a unique something special about it. One ingredient cannot take over the other, cannot overpower. So we have to find that right balance of the different ingredients and finding the right mix of land uses that's going to make Point Molate the community that all of you really feel belongs here. And we also sort of we introduced these ideas in terms of sort of a qualitative discussion about what makes a community. And it is the sense of place. Point Molate is it's a spectacular site. It's a very special site. We heard it over and over again, and we absolutely agree with it. There are very, very few places where you feel that they are special. And there are certain things that make this place special, just the location, the views to the bay, the history, the story that this place already has. And what is going to make the community, what is going to, the future community that comes here, what's going to give it that unique sense of place is when all of these special elements are integrated within that. The future community embraces these special elements to make it continue to keep it special. Recreating and conserving habitat, we heard a lot. Definitely, this is a special place as far as ecology is concerned. There are a lot of special status species and rich habitat here. So respecting that and acknowledging that. Growing the Richmond economy, again, very important about what the economic drivers might be, finding the jobs, housing balance, and so on and so forth, and building a community that really is a living, working community. And from here on, John is actually going to take us through some of the explorations that that the team engaged in after hearing what we heard from all of you.
Hello, everybody. I heard some younger members of our audience there just a second ago. I thank you, Poonam, for getting us to here, and I'm going to just take us all the way to the end. I see some empty chairs, so some people have eaten and run. But hopefully anybody else who is standing in the back, there's lots of seats here now available to us. Poonam has described the background of what we've heard and the opportunities of this property, the ecological constraints of this property, and we're beginning to put those together into some meaningful guidance to future entities that may engage in design and planning on this property. The point of our process this summer is to really understand what's really sacred here and to put that guidance in place so that as a new property owner is engaged and as that property owner may begin to envision uses on this property, they have some sound guidance and policy. So it's really important that we get this right. I also just wanted to say we have Spanish translation going on here in the audience tonight, and our translator is busy working. She's been engaging folks as they have come in. Bathrooms are down the hall. So let's talk a little bit about the site planning framework that we've put together. It should look quite familiar because we're going through a pretty logical sequence and process here of understanding the open space and the environmental framework here that really should guide any future development opportunities on this property. And so this diagram simply indicates in green those hillside areas, in blue the drainages on the hillside as well. And I'm hoping I can. And I think one area in particular that we've heard a lot about is this area, and this is going to be important as we start to talk about some future development options. The beach park, and just how important that is to folks. This is a major public amenity, a public place for recreation, and it really wants to remain public. When you're there, if you're kayaking, if you're at a picnic table, you want that to feel. What we heard is that folks really want to feel like they're still here in this vast nature and not encumbered by adjacent development. We also heard a lot of importance to this drainage in particular and some of the sensitive species that we have mapped and identified there, and how that whole system really connects out into the bay, the greater ecology, the eel beds. So that's really marked there in a pretty careful way as associated with this framework diagram. There's other open space areas, other drainages that are certainly important. Other gathering spaces, such as incorporating open space at the point, incorporating open space and active outdoor recreation areas here in the context of the Winehaven district as well. The Bay Trail being a continuous public open space network and public access trail all along the shoreline is certainly a really important framework element. We started to indicate Stenmark Drive, but also just other access routes for maintaining public access throughout this. What's a walkable community? How do you get from the power station down to the Winehaven building, Building 6 or Building 1, and out to the Bay Trail and the shoreline? That sort of connectivity is really important, associated with a basic planning framework as well. We looked at view corridors and just where you're able to see the bay and see elements in the distance. These start to become important as we looked at some of the site planning things that we'll show in just a little while. There's a great view here at the point. As you're looking out across the bay, you have the San Rafael Bridge, you have the Golden Gate Bridge, you can see over to Raccoon Strait and Angel Island, San Francisco in the distance. Some really important public views, and you would want those to be respected. That's for the benefit of the public, so we want to really be able to capture those things. Historic buildings and historic districts, whether they're well known and they're marked, like the Winehaven district in the individual buildings that make that up, to some of the cultural resources that we know are in this part of the property, the Chinese shrimp camp, as well as Indian burial grounds, Widgeons, etc. We've looked at community anchors as a key framework, and really three kind of started to emerge, being really important. Certainly the Winehaven district itself is a majorly important community anchor, but folks were also really saw the point as having some real opportunity and what could happen out there as a link between other parts of the property, like Winehaven district, and the existing pier. What's its role in that linkage becomes an important question. And certainly over at the beach park and the idea of an interpretive center or a place, a gateway to that open space. If you use that network of roads and the views that we saw, those that went on the tours, really talked a lot about the idea of an interpretive center to tell that story of those cultural resources in this part of the district in particular. So as we put those together really as a baseline to then start to think about how you assemble uses and answering the question that Poonam posed, what makes a community? So we're doing that certainly from a social standpoint, understanding what's this mix of uses. We also are going to start doing that from a financial standpoint as well, and that's been a theme tonight, is really understanding What makes a financially feasible community? How do you have the right mix of uses? How do we make this inclusive? How do we plan for affordable housing and affordability? And what's the balance with other market rate uses? We have to get these things into balance. And different uses come at different costs. So that's still an ongoing and really important part of the work ahead. What we're saying is that based on the work that's been done, the feedback from you all, and these planning frameworks that we've started to identify, we've come up with really two options here, two different directions. And when we like looking at different things because it allows us to compare and contrast them and have some better dialogues. So we have one option, which we're calling A, and it's the Winehaven Commercial District. We heard a lot about the idea of preserving the Winehaven District for commercial uses. It becomes much more about offices, commercial spaces, maybe it's maker spaces and incubator businesses, could be anchors for nonprofits, there's restaurants, all these sorts of adaptive reuse things. Institutions might be able to be located here. And that really becomes the emphasis of the Winehaven District. But we have this housing bubble question, right? The yellow being the housing, blue is the institutional commercial type uses, purple being hospitality type uses, red being retail kinds of uses, and I think we know what green stands for. So if we put a lot of blues and purples in the Winehaven District, it really starts to mean that the drum lot becomes the larger yellow circle, just making things very simple here. That's a very developable site, it's flat, it's closest to the 580, it's closest to bring infrastructure to it, and so that makes sense to consider that and to think about that for residential uses. So that's kind of in a nutshell. That's option A, the Winehaven Commercial District. Option B kind of flips that around and says, we heard a lot about how sacred the beach park is. We heard a lot about that ecological corridor and down the drainage. And so, what if we really said the drum lot is a much smaller footprint for residential uses, it's much more about open space, and instead let's really focus the idea of a mixed-use neighborhood in the Winehaven District. Let's put people in some of those buildings. Let's find new opportunities to create a really interesting neighborhood and a community with front porches and streets and sidewalks. And let's just recreate the Winehaven District in that way. And so that's what option B starts to explore. We're not saying one's better than the other. They're both achieving a lot of the same goals, but they just do it differently, and it allows us to compare and contrast and come up with perhaps a C or a D or an E that even comes up with a better mix moving forward. In both of these schemes that we're going to show, the point has a little different flavor as well, and we'll show that when we kind of zoom in here. So this was option A. These are the bubbles then in the Winehaven District. We're still tucking in just a little bit of some of the residential homes here up in this canyon. This is an area that if you were on a tour, your tour buses, I think, exited out a gate that's currently the city's courtyard. There's a lot of old light poles and street signs and stuff laying back in there. It's fairly flat. It's already quite disturbed, and it actually makes a pretty developable, minimally impactful little neighborhood area. It actually has some great views that look out as you get just a little bit higher. And it's nicely walkable right in the center of this district. And then here we have some of the existing cottages. Some could be more hospitality based, maybe with a new hotel. And then those could be artist in residence, or could be rental cottages. But some may be just used for pure residential purposes. Out at the point in option A, there's still an interesting mix of uses. They're anchored by open space. They include some housing, some institutional uses, and some amount of retail uses out there as well. I'm just going to keep moving. So we've drawn then what some of these building footprints could start to look like. Now, we're not ultimately the purveyors of designing these buildings as part of this process, but it's important for us to begin to test these footprints, because how big the building is starts to drive the kinds of uses that can occur there, and certainly some of the housing targets that could be achieved. We want to know really what that looks like so that we don't end up with false hopes or false promises. And what the exercise that our team undertook told us some interesting things. The idea that we have to cover the whole site with housing in order to achieve some of these targets was dispelled. That we can actually fit a lot of these interesting mix of uses within some pretty compact footprints, and also within some building types that we feel are relatively achievable, kind of able to be financed, and can do a lot of the other things that we think that we've heard are really important, whether that's affordable housing, whether that's setbacks to creeks and some things like that. So just looking at what that starts to look like, there's a few interesting things I think to talk about here at the drum lot. This is one where I think it's pretty controversial, what happens at the drum lot, and that the ecological sensitivity that we were hearing. A couple of things that we were able to accomplish within some of these footprints is still maintaining a setback from the drainage here, as well as creating a little bit more open space in the development pattern to create a little canyon so that other drainage is able to connect back through. We're still able to do some of those things within the context of still locating 75% of the residential development in that area. It makes for a compact neighborhood. It makes for the ability to put some retail, to put some other kinds of uses within that district. Those could be some amenities that could also serve folks over at the beach park as well. Out at the Point, there's more of an institutional function, just a little bit of residential, and an opportunity for hotel conference center out in this zone. And then within the Winehaven district, these are really following existing footprints. This is Building 6. This is the non-historic addition in this area that could be, that same footprint could be repurposed for new institutional types of uses, so just really minimizing the development footprint, and then just continuing out in some of the graded kind of railroad track area just here a little bit to the north, some additional development areas. Similarly at Building 1, more of a hotel function could be inserted into the shell of the existing building that's there. You could actually do some pretty interesting adaptive reuse, and then there's opportunity for some additional development area just here to the south. This is also a fairly disturbed area. It's kind of that hillside that drops down towards the building as you're driving in and making the turn around the road. So what this exercise was starting to tell us is that it was actually not as hard of an exercise as we thought it was going to be in June to begin to locate these uses in a way that we thought they started to create some interesting neighborhoods and started to create an interesting place, and to do so within a currently disturbed footprint. And this was really important to our process, and I think responds to a lot of the community sensitivities that you all have put forward about footprints, about ecological impacts. So to zoom in just a little bit, and these are some conceptual sketches. So we have the building kind of footprint, land use diagram on the left side, and then just a little vision that starts to say what that could start to look like, because how big it is, how it's designed, those are all really important questions. We're not ultimately the end design group here, but it's important for us to begin to test these things, and for you all to say that doesn't work, or this is what works about it, this is what doesn't work about it. it and to tell us those things. So this proposes adaptive reuse of Winehaven, the power station, Building 6, there's live workspaces, new institutional uses, host of land uses within the commercial area. And then some of the more subjective things that, that this sketch starts to respond to talks about more of an active plaza between buildings 1 and 6, really connecting that plaza back up to the historic power station. The idea of skylights in the roof of the Winehaven building so that light can come down into whatever uses could start to occur within that building, that there's ways to adaptively reuse buildings in a historically sensitive way that really make them even more usable. Other ways to do infill at Building 1, continuous promenades and bay trails throughout this area, and it really starts to highlight really what that could look like as the public is able to then move through this space and move right up through the middle, up into these neighborhoods and trailheads on up into the hillsides. Residential uses are tucked into the canyon. There's low-scale infill at the cottages, and it's all a very walkable district. Moving out to the Point, this would be much more of an institutional type of a use and an anchor. There's both setback areas, open space, more ecological restoration zones that could be envisioned here, small-scale retail associated with connecting out to the pier, and still some small-scale residential uses there as well. And a sketch showing what that could start to look like and what some of these building heights could start to look like. One of the things that's pretty interesting about the Point is that this is a really big area and that hill behind it is actually quite tall. And so when you do start to put what should be good architecture and buildings in that area, the site tends to absorb them quite readily. It didn't feel to us as we were studying this that we were creating something that was just completely out of scale. And that was I think, really important because the scale of the bay, the scale of the hill should be the drivers of what happens on the Point, not the scale of a bunch of buildings. And I think that the balance shows that things could work okay here. That was pretty important to us. Then looking at the drum lot, and again, this is the scheme that puts the majority of the housing just within the drum lot area. So this begins to show the drainage here, potentially the drainage here. I can just kind of switch to the sketch. Additional drainage here through the center, and so that the buildings the buildings begin to respond to that ecological framework in that way. This starts to imagine what if the Quonset huts were repurposed for more of a kayak rental, some active recreation kinds of uses, and really emphasizing some active recreation. There's one idea that's expressed in this sketch, which says that if you were really trying to restore this drainage here, perhaps you'd want to flip the driveway into the park just to the north side, so you'd come in at the Quonset hut and you'd wrap in this way. There's already a lot of disturbed areas there, and that could allow for some more restoration in this part of the site. Just an idea that's expressed and explored here. So then you would have the road and you would have the Bay Trail that goes through there, but you would then eliminate the other road. So just an idea to begin to test these things. I want to talk through the other concept, the concept that emphasizes residential uses within the Winehaven core district, and with really focusing things there with a much lighter touch over to the drum lot in response to a lot of the feedback that we heard. So zooming in here, again, you're going to see a lot of similar development footprints. This is not putting development up into the hillsides. We're not showing massive development on the hill. We're not showing development in the meadow in the restored area here. We're not actually showing development here in the little canyon loop as well. We're really fitting it within the disturbed areas of the site, and we're finding that that's pretty achievable. So here you can see, just in terms of percentages, roughly 60% of the housing would be located up here in the Winehaven district, and in a similar fashion as we had just studied in the other option. So this really concentrates more of the commercial or institutional type uses, really to the existing Winehaven brick building, and it says let's really repurpose the other building for more of a residential use. And then this even says, that the concrete building that's covered with vines, that would actually just go away and would be repurposed and just be redeveloped as a new housing type building. So the historic piece is retained. The other piece would be demolished. The non-historic piece would be demolished. And that was expressed in the range of those exercises from the last community meeting. There's other uses up in the cottages, some residential, some could be more institutional type uses, or even perhaps some commercial type uses as well. Certainly continuous open space and walkable areas along the waterfront, and in particular the Bay Trail. Out on the Point, this is a little different scheme. This starts to suggest it's much more of a major hotel and conference center kind of a destination. There's still institutional uses here mixed in, and then a little bit more housing, and that housing actually kind of wraps at the base of the hill and begins to kind of connect this district back over to the Winehaven district. So if Winehaven's where there's a lot of housing, folks are able to walk and to connect the two, these two areas. Within the drumlin, this one starts to be remarkably different than the other one. So I think what we were hearing, the sensitivity related to the beach park, and this is really the main kind of active area of the beach park right now. And so that's the area that remains as open space behind it. So if you're in this beach park and you're looking up into the hills, you kind of have nothing really in your way. And instead, we've dashed in both a soccer field as well as a velodrome. Velodrome has been a use and an idea that's gained a certain amount of traction out there. And so that certainly would fit in this context. I think ultimately, in terms of a planning framework, whether that area was a sports field, a velodrome, or if it was purely a restored area and set back in an interpretive center, I think all of those things would fit within the framework that this begins to imagine. And then any housing is really in a very compact footprint, and it's pushed over towards the Quonset hut and away from the main part of the beach park. And this is really just in response to the comments and the discussion that's been held here. So that buffer to the creek is really the greatest in this scheme. This is really that existing drainage, and then you can see that the buffers from any housing is even greater. So just a little bit about some precedents that start to show sort of what these things could look like within the Winehaven district. Adaptive reuse, there's some kind of really cool precedents. Reuse of old buildings, I think a lot of us kind of have these ideas. A lot of hotel chains and more independent hotels are using old buildings and finding ways to adapt them. Cavallo Point, just here in the Bay Area, is a really interesting precedent in terms of the food and the dining, the open space, that this is all very public and publicly accessible, as well as it has residences as well. The Urban Outfitters headquarters in the Philadelphia Navy Yard, this is all an adaptive reuse of an old existing structure. I think we can imagine a transformation and a way to reuse some of these buildings, whether it's more of a commercial use or it's more of an incubator or it's artist in residence kinds of spaces. There's lots of different options and just lots of really cool examples of these things out there. How a community green functions, again, Cavallo Point. To housing, Certainly we know about reuse of old historic structures for residential purposes within the Presidio. I wished our buildings looked this nice. I would hope that that could happen one day. These are certainly really nice. There's other examples. I don't know if this is really the best one, but this is on Townsend in San Francisco, but it's a brick structure that essentially had other housing inserted into it. Don't know if this is quite the right aesthetic for where we are, but lots of examples of how you can reuse a historic building, in this case the concrete building, building 6, and reuse that for other purposes. Windsortown Green as a place where everybody comes together, Chrissy Field, just the vast open space that's preserved, yet this was a created place for the public in a very sensitive ecological context with the pathway that goes through the center. I think imagine this as the Bay Trail, or imagine this as the connective tissue between Building 1 and Building 6. Certainly some of the hospitality options, Cannery Row, if you can peel away the Disney effect, there's some sensitively created buildings and some really interesting history that's really there at the core. And UC Santa Cruz has created the Marine Science Center. This is out at their coastal bluffs. And it's a pretty interesting precedent in that this is where it's an institutional use that was able to come in. They created some new buildings. I don't believe that there was adaptive reuse here, but they created this institutional base in the context of what they study. And they've actually done such an amazing job that weddings are held here. And if you could find brides and grooms that are getting married here within the context of the science, and the big baleen whale sculpture. This is where school kids come from all over Santa Cruz County to come out here and to learn about this ecology. If we could be so fortunate as to have a UC Santa Cruz institution here, or something like the Romberg-Tiburon Center, those would be really, I think, culturally appropriate, and some of their footprints would be pretty interesting out at the point. I think that they could receive something like this pretty well. Just some of the residential development. This was an example of one interesting development that had just really a mix of densities within it. This is up in Canada, up in Victoria. It was also done in a way that was net zero, so it had zero energy inputs. There's a lot of sensitive, sustainable features associated with this, and just how open space, in this case really water, was incorporated right into the development areas. I think, in our context it might not be water, but it might be open space, coastal scrub, and certainly some of the drainages that we were talking about coming down through this property as well. Opportunities for interpretive centers and places of learning, certainly again within the Drumlot area, whether it's in the Quonset hut or across the street. With that, we want to wrap it up, and we want to turn it over again to the kinds of questions and the comments and the answers that we can help to provide, or the comments that we're going to record and continue to develop this vision moving forward. Do want to just remind folks that this process doesn't end tonight, and I think for many in this room, this process will continue even longer down the road. We're going to be at the Planning Commission at a date that is just getting settled here at the end of the month. So a draft vision, a draft framework is going to be presented there as at a public forum. It'll be posted on our website about a week prior. And so there will be a time for public comment, both through the website as well as during the Planning Commission meeting. There will be a follow-up City Council presentation in mid-October. Again, those dates are still getting finalized, but those things will be posted on the website, so you'll be able to have access to that, I think, well in advance. Those things are really getting resolved actually as we speak, but certainly later this week, things should shake out in terms of confirmation of those dates. So this process doesn't end tonight, and your continued input is going to be welcome. This presentation is going to be posted to the website here just as soon as we can get back to the office and get things uploaded. And we're still taking specific comments and feedbacks just on tonight's presentation through the 8th of September. So you still have a little over a week to make additional comments related to the presentation and the materials tonight. Poonam, did I miss anything? We got it, Lena? Okay. With that, we have a couple of mics. We welcome your input, your comments, all your hard questions.
Thank you. I'm a bit new to this, and I'm assuming that the image that's on the screen is the point.
Yes, this is the
Sorry,
point.
am I in your ear?
Yes, this is the point.
Some of my concern in both alternatives that you described is public access to the point. With institutional uses, conference centers, hotels, they're essentially private uses, and I have significant concerns about such a spectacular part of Point Molate being potentially not accessible or limited access to the public, and I'd appreciate if you could comment on that.
Yeah, so I think that the framework that or the vision that we're hearing from you all says that regardless of the use, there needs to be public access. I think absolutely all shoreline areas are mandated by the state of California to be publicly accessible. So there's a 100-foot ban, but we would go much further than that. And in fact, in these options, we've pushed things back even more and said there needs to be a public grid of streets and sidewalks, trails, and these things that maintain public access. And so I think you should keep pushing that comment, and we'll be wanting to note that and make sure that that's clear associated with our documentation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tania Pulido, and we organized yesterday Richmond-owned community. Okay, hold on, let me read this again. Richmond Community-Owned Development Enterprise. We organized a meeting yesterday, and we had about 30 people come out, and we had a conversation about Point Molate, and we facilitated in a way so, everyone felt like had input to say, and essentially some people came today, but a lot of people didn't because they just don't feel like these meetings are catered to certain residents. It is a lot of information, but we did come up with some stuff that I want to share. And some of it was around non-negotiables and just really people wanting to feel welcome and safe when they go into the community, So, of course, like no gated communities, no luxury housing, of course, minimize the cost for the city and prioritize like local-owned businesses. And then also something that hasn't come up here that did come up there and was like a big discussion point was just like really honoring the indigenous community that existed there, and just like how are you consulting them or how are you engaging them to make sure that we're taking them in consideration around land management and what to honor and how to honor it, and public access, and then affordable housing, of course, like mixed income. But I think overall it was more so about the feel, like people wanting to feel like when they come into Point Molate, they're welcomed because, for example, some of the people, and even me including sometimes, like you go into a community and you see this beautiful housing and then people are like, am I even welcome here, and in some case, an example would be even like Point Richmond, for example. Some people that live in my neighborhood or that I work with, they don't feel welcome going into Point Richmond just because of the economic class that exists there and the geographic. So just being mindful of that as we continue to build, and also thinking about how do we facilitate these conversations so that we can make sure that everyone feels like, oh, okay, like let's have a real dialogue about issues that are important to me as we develop like a vision for this land that's public. Thank you.
You're great. those are all really important, and I want you to be sure to either send those to us. If you could write them, we're taking notes. Christine over there, raise your hand. She's writing everything down. But if you'd like to write more of a formal letter or just send those in an email, we would welcome that greatly. So thank you.
Am I next?
Sorry, over here.
Hi, thanks for letting me ask my question. So I have two questions. One is about the transportation that we were looking at, this idea of putting the flyway over so that people from Marin County can get out to Point Molate. That depends on regional funding strongly, but we still, in all of that, didn't talk about getting out of there. And, you know, everything here, let's say you have 1,000 homes to kind of split the diff, that's probably about 1,500 cars. So we're still not talking about how people are going to get out of there. You still have to get out of there, and there's still a toll plaza there. And I don't think they're going to take that bridge down or take the toll plaza completely away, because that would wreck a major thoroughfare for the Bay Area. So that's one question. Should I ask them both and then wait, or you want to do one at a time?
Let's do one at a time. I think the issue of there's issue of it's backed up right now, and MTC's aware of that. The feedback that they're giving us is that they're on about a 4 or 5 year project to really address that. That's been an issue for them that's gotten worse in recent years, and they're anticipating that getting better. That's gonna help a little bit. Then there's the new folks that might be coming out here and that might be living here, and how do they get in and out through that interchange, and what how many trips are there, and what infrastructure changes need to be made to respond to that. That's the second question, and that's gonna vary depending on what uses are here. Some of the trade-offs are normal sort of residential uses tend to generate a little bit more trip generation in the mornings and the evenings. Other kinds of uses might generate traffic all day long. Senior housing tends to spread its window out. It's not so peak oriented towards those higher traffic areas. So a lot of those questions are going to start to drive, what that sort of traffic picture starts to look like.
Yeah, and I do. Sure.
Everything that John said is absolutely right. The other thing also is that we talked to MTC.
That never happens.
Well, we are in a community meeting. Just kidding. But so we talked to MTC, and we talked about this very specific scenario around the interchange and the access. And as John was saying, that currently MTC has they're working on this project, which is the Richmond San Rafael Bridge Forward, and they're looking at changing the travel pattern from single occupancy vehicles to high occupancy vehicles. And for MTC, they consider that as the low hanging fruit, because it does not require a whole lot of operational changes or trying to get into the complicated organizational having to pass through a lot of hoops. So even with that, low-hanging fruit and the basic change, they are expecting a 10% reduction in the backup. And what they pointed out was basically they're working with the current right-of-way. What that tells us is that this is not the current traffic backup situation is not a permanent situation. MTC is already working on it, and MTC is willing to work with the city of Richmond in future as the future plans for Point Molate develop, and actually think about what options might there be to redesign the interchange, or what improvements are needed. So there is going to be a need for an ongoing conversation with MTC on that.
Thank you. I still will say, though, that their plan to make this big reduction is all about high occupant, getting people to carpool. So if that really worked, I don't think the Bay Bridge would look like it looks most of the time. it just doesn't work. And the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge is taking the hit from what people can't stand to go over the Bay Bridge anymore. They take the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge. I drive over that bridge. I also do native plant restoration at Point Molate every morning, and I don't go out there until 10 a.m. And I have been stuck in traffic many times, and I still don't see how they're going to do that. I mean, I just feel like we're ignoring the traffic situation, and then that leads into safety issues. There's going to be cars out there.
Yeah, we heard from the fire department and
I
concerns about how do we get in, how do we get folks out, and so I think all these are the right questions.
So my next question.
You had one more. Okay.
What was it? Yeah. I just, a lot of people are talking about the need for affordable housing and that, it has to be not just a haven for the wealthy, but the settlement agreement, it's not a judgment, it's a settlement agreement, says very clearly that the developer can opt out of any affordable housing requirements. So that's baked in. So I don't know why we haven't address that issue while we're promising people that they can have affordable housing. It's very easy to buy out of it. And you make a lot more money than you lose by buying out of it.
Lena, are you able to respond to that?
Sure. So the judgment requires that the development comply with the city's inclusionary housing ordinance, which there are two options. One is to develop a certain percentage of affordable housing, and that meets your inclusionary requirement, or to pay the in lieu fee. I think, though, the city will be soliciting proposals, and as part of a proposal development, a developer will bring in their proposal to either build affordable housing or pay the in lieu fee. So I think the council, in its selection of a master developer, can also build in the development or one option over the other.
So there's truth to that. There's truth to that math, but I think that the feedback that this process has taken in is that there's a desire for an inclusive, non-exclusive kind of a place. And so I think as the developers make a proposal and as city council evaluates those, that's probably one of the key places for a choice to be made. And I would hope, based on this process, that those that are more inclusive are given higher scores, that sort of a thing.
Sorry, we have one question here for a long time, and then I
saw Jim and I have Norman.
One question here, then I'm going over to the other side.
Hi, I'm interested in the issue of, you had a map of all the potential housing sites, and there were some, I thought, in the middle between Winehaven and that area by the beach, even farther back than that. So the question is, did you not consider those other areas? Am I misinterpreting the map, or?
Do you have a different? Oh, I don't know which one this one. Let's figure out which one this is. Oh, we're going way back.
Yeah. Okay, I am kind of misinterpreting the map. I thought there was more in the middle between the beach and Winehaven, but I think you've got them all. So I'll just say one other thing. I personally think it has to be inclusionary housing, no in lieu fees. We've heard from many community members that they want this to be a place where everyone is welcome. And one of the things that can do that is to have multi-levels of income levels for housing.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Norman LaForce, and I represent the Sierra Club. And I have these couple comments. With regard to the housing issue, what we didn't see tonight was how you're going to integrate housing with a transportation system that would allow for inclusionary, low-income, even affordable housing. We know from experience that if you want to run bus lines, you have to be near dense urban areas to make bus lines economically feasible. There is no BART operation anywhere near this. So for anybody, frankly, to stand up and say, we're going to put housing out here and it's going to be inclusionary and it's going to be affordable without showing how you're going to pay for the mass transit system that's going to be needed to provide the transportation for the people of those income levels who don't have their Mercedes and the Porches to drive around is baloney, okay?
There's an important link there between equity and access, absolutely.
What was missing from this infrastructure discussion was the very issue of how you develop the transportation infrastructure to allow for that. Secondly, we know from the EIR that was done for the casino, which included other lesser scale development proposals that included things like 1,000-unit housing and less development. Okay, in every one of those scenarios, alternatives in the EIR, except for the no project alternative, the result for the traffic impacts was it would be a significant, unavoidable, and unmitigatable impact to transportation in and out of Point Molate. So it's a false notion that somehow we're going to build our way out of the transportation problem that the site presents. Lastly, infrastructure can drive any project. And what I heard tonight was what I hear all the time from developers, which is, well, you just give us a lot of development. We need that to build infrastructure, and we need that so you can get all this money to your city through tax revenues. Well, often the cities do that, and they don't get that development because it turns out to be uneconomical. I've seen no studies done for these proposals to show really who's going to go out to a site that's not near any transportation, that's off in an area, and is not one near the areas of where people want to work in the high tech and the other areas of commercial development in the San Francisco Bay Area. This is an isolated site. All of those things need to be done before anybody can talk about alternatives, and before anybody can even think about the notion that you're going to have inclusionary affordable housing, because also you haven't even talked about where's the school going to go. Are people going to have to drive their kids out to some other location in Richmond to go to school? Who's going to build the school? Schools are not a part of an environmental impact report requirement. So who's going to build the school? Where is that going to be built? And how is that going to be funded? Anyway, those are a lot of questions.
Great questions.
Hi, I wanted to just speak to some of the things that I've heard, because, again, a lot of us spend our daytime reading everything that's going on in terms of urban design and urban activity around the world, and there's so many things that are changing, and it's difficult for us who grew up with automobiles, who grew up with the suburbs, who grew up with the commute. It's very difficult for us to really imagine that is not the only standard, and it isn't, and it won't be in the future. The whole thing about traffic, I would argue, and there are a lot of documents that say this, that we're at peak traffic now. Chevron and the other oil companies are concerned about a steadily reducing demand for gasoline. Newer people are not taking the step to buy cars and buy 3-car garages and do that whole thing. They're tending to stay in the city. They're tending to want to operate with different transportation systems. These devices right here have changed the way that people communicate and work. The whole notion that people will just get up in the morning and go to work somewhere else is no longer the only standard, because larger and larger numbers of people are working through these devices. They're working from cafes, they're working from home, they're working on their commute. It's just a completely different future scenario, and what we have to do is we think about places, we have to think about places that people have occupied for 1,000 years. They were occupied before automobiles came into being. They have tolerated the existence of automobiles. They're as popular as they were before automobiles came into being, and they will be popular after that mode of transportation is displaced by other modes of transportation. And we want to try to look at this community in terms of its possibility to be an enduring place that endures these trends that come and go. You know, at one time we had steam locomotives everywhere. Okay, at one time people crossed the ocean in ocean liners. These systems change, and so what we want to do is design our communities around the values of the community that we have. I also cannot help but bring to light the fact that every one of our schools right now is filled to the brim. We are in the middle of an echo boom of some kind. There are children being born, there are children in this community, and we aren't going to be able to accommodate those children with our existing residential capacity. We must build more. We have to build more here, they have to build more throughout the Bay Area. There are studies that indicate that, and the only way that we're going to be able to create places for people to afford to live is to add more places. Otherwise, the places that we have continue to be bid up and bid up and bid up as people who have more means simply displace people who have less means. And so we have an opportunity here to do that. Finally, when we talk about transportation, again, let's not forget that we have the ferry. The ferry was originally started out, it was called the Water Transit Authority, the WTA, and then they added an E. They added an E because it is actually the Water Emergency Transit Authority. And why did they do that? Because it became clear that in case of any major shake or any major earthquake, most of our highway system is going to go down. When that happens, the one system, the one common element that we have that can get people from one place to another is the bay. It'll still be there. At one time, San Francisco had the largest and most developed ferry network in the world. Now it's up in Seattle in terms of the West Coast. But we have that capability, we have that history. And so I just say to everybody, again, try to avoid the details, the funding mechanisms, and focus on the vision for what a nice place would be. Focus on how you could turn this into a place that you would want to be, that your children or grandchildren want to be. And that's just what I would offer. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Things are... Richard Mitchell is the planning director for the city of Richmond and is going to be able to answer the questions. Thank you, Norman. Thank you. We're going to continue with other questions. We have plenty of time, and we're going to allow others to ask questions and make comments. And if Richard would like to respond, if any of us up here will respond, we'll do that as well.
John, I'm going to keep this short, but could you go back to one of the fundamental slides where you showed a range of housing alternatives? It was 3 slides at the beginning from the number 2 workshop. Because I think some of us were there, the number 2 workshop. I think you just passed it. The range. Okay, one thing I think is very critical, and I appreciate KCRT posting the workshop number 2. Because I went back and listened, I thought I did hear some themes. And it doesn't reflect this, I'm sorry. If you blew this, this one, where you've got a lot of housing, okay?
Maximizes housing on the drum lot.
That was 1 of 10 tables.
Yep.
That should be shrunk. This one here on the left, where a number of people said no housing in the South Watershed. That was 7 out of the 10 tables. That needs to be expanded by 7.
Hear you.
That option doesn't even show in A and B in your further thing. So that's the fundamental, and this is about the people of Richmond speaking. We'll hear from the politicians, but this is about the people of Richmond. So I think it really should reflect what was at that meeting, and that should show in that way.
Thank you, Jim. And again, these are intended to be a range of directions that we heard and that we responded with these emphases. We did not show an option with zero housing on the drum lot. It's still a very developable site within this property, but we showed it as a very reduced footprint to show the balance and the other options that can occur in that area in concert with some housing. So that's how we move forward to show some increments in there. Yep, that's the community workshop right there. Yep. So yes. So thank you. But we did not take housing entirely off of the drum lot. So. Yep. We didn't say that we were representing this. We said that we put some housing back onto the drum lot to test that and to show that and to get all of your feedback. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Poonam, who's next?
I think I'm next. Thank you. I appreciate Jim mentioning that. I think that there is one thing that's missing, which is the percentages of who thought which one was a good idea. There's no data here about the people who are representative by the sample that you've got, and this is the city. These are people that showed up. We are representing the city, a lot more people than this, but there should be some data about how many people thought the first one was a good idea and how many people thought that the last one was a good idea. The other thing, I just wanted to mention those two things, and then also that that trust is really important here. There's something about trust that isn't going on, and so rather than grabbing for trust when you're trying to get people to trust you, you've got to call a settlement, and judgment, a judgment. When you wrote judgment up there, I immediately felt like you didn't understand. Because from what I understand, that this is a settlement that was made, not a judgment from a judge. It was a settlement between two parties who came to agreement.
We've gone over the settlement judgment issue a number of times, and we've acknowledged that there's disagreement out there. I think, as we said earlier tonight, you can call it what you want. It was a judge, right. And it is the direction of your city council to this project moving forward.
Calling it a judgment. So I think that's the trust issue. So there you're saying we're going to take that word judgment, and you're also going to not get some trust. So I just want to share that with you as my observation of what might be going on.
Thank you. Poonam, who is next?
We have this lady.
Hi, I think it is obvious that there seems to be a ball rolling in terms of development coming to Point Molate, and I just think that it would be helpful in the way that some things are explained. I think there's talk about physical accessibility, but also if maybe the conversation went more like, hey, we're planning to have possibly like a conference center, and we'll make sure that there are community days where community members can take advantage of this area at a lower fee. You know, things like that to really help people feel like they're, like it's understood how the city of Richmond wants to benefit, the people who are here want to benefit from the possible development that would come. So even in just explaining, you know, the number of, my boss is trying to get the microphone for me. Explaining how many housing units, even just going a little bit further to acknowledge, hey, we're looking at how many would be rental units that would be subject to rent control, how many would be owned, would just help, I think, people feel like it's really being taken into account, how to not just make it physically accessible, but economically accessible to the community as a whole. That's just in how it's being explained.
That's great. I applaud you, and I'm glad you're raising that level of detail, because really tonight a lot of this is about some physical forms and access, and you're kind of going to the next level about what are the percentages, how is it inclusive, what are the rules that begin to guide this, and the vision plan can capture that as well. Poonam?
Okay, got a couple of questions. There's historical buildings, right? They have to be preserved. What does that mean? Like, what does that actually mean to be preserved? And what's going to happen with the cottages? What's going to happen with the cottages? I don't know what's developed over it on the map. So can you answer that first?
The cottages are repurposed for either rental housing or for hospitality kinds of uses. So they're shown as preserved. There's some additional infill that can occur around them. That's what's shown.
And is that included in the 670?
Sure.
Okay.
If they're counted for housing, yeah.
Okay, and then the second question is, so I think framing matters a lot in politics, and this conversation has been framed a lot 70-30 in terms of the development. It's like 70% open space, 30% development, but that's a 70% minimum and 30% maximum. So are both of those, I hate a mic.
No, we need you to use the mic because it's being recorded. Just, God damn it. You're sounding great.
So are both of those options 70-30, or are any of them possibly 80-20? Because it's the same, it fits the same requirement, right? 75-25, 78, whatever the math is, balance it 5 way, 5 the other way.
Yep.
So are both of those 70-30?
So the 30% is not the measure of footprint. So we're being a little bit more relaxed with with the 30% number, because what we're finding is that to achieve some of the target numbers, we don't need to cover 30% of the site. And we showed some maps up here that said, first we need to change some of those that 30% designation from the 1997 plan, because it didn't respond to some ecologically sensitive areas that we think are important. So we modified that. Then we've actually located and tested that we can locate useful development and the targets within a even further reduced footprint. So the 30% is a little bit of a looser term. That might be part of the area that's sold, but it's not necessarily that is paved or developed. Does that sort of answer the question?
And then and then lastly, so what I want to suggest is that none of the options have housing only at the Winehaven area, right? So you could have an option where there's no housing on the beach area and have that be as recreational, as an open space, as public as possible. And then you have mixed income housing up at Winehaven, and the only thing that I see preventing that is just building up, right? But if you're able to build up on the actual Winehaven structure, like I think I saw the Philadelphia building there, and then you build housing behind that, you could fit the 670 there and then preserve as much of the ecological area around the water, right? That's a total possibility, right? So can we get one of those as possible options that you give to the Planning Commission?
So the math on that could certainly work, and it would require taller buildings or less institutional, less commercial kinds of uses, or you'd have to expand the footprint out. It starts to get into some difficult feasibility questions. Taller buildings cost a lot more money to build. How do you handle parking and things associated with those buildings? Everything gets a lot more costly. So there's a little bit of a sweet spot in there in terms of some of the heights of buildings that are shown now. Some of our next steps are with our economics team, looking a little bit more into the pro forma and trying to get a sense of how things might pencil. How might this be realistic and attractive to a master developer coming in, balancing infrastructure costs, balancing the construction costs of buildings versus some of the return, balancing affordable housing components to these projects. And all of that's a little bit of a squishy thing that we can only kind of start to inform the edges to. We're criticized because we didn't show an option with zero housing on the drum lot, but I'm answering that would be the effect of a zero housing on the drum lot would be probably some more expensive buildings in the Winehaven area. And that certainly is, everything's within the range of a framework. We didn't actually show a framework that says you have to put housing on the drum lot. That's not a framework direction that certainly this process has generated. So that certainly could still be out there as a no housing option on the drum lot. We've heard no housing period on the whole property, and so that's certainly heard as well.
Hi, my name is Sasha. I also was present at the RCDE. We facilitated some more community engagement to try to get some more voices or ideas around the Point Molate development. I just feel like we had a lot of good issues raised about transportation, about the school, about the traffic. I mean, when I think about the schools, we have schools here that are dilapidated that you guys have not rebuilt, that haven't been rebuilt, like Stige, which is one of the oldest schools here, has the highest black population as far as children, and it's not being built, so I don't even think that you would think of building a school at this place. Also about the in lieu fees, I know that, I think Lena was saying that the council basically would, they would be picking the developer, but I'm concerned because the council, some of them are pro-development. And it's not necessarily mean that the council is going to choose to have something that has affordable housing, or that they won't choose a developer that wants to pay the fees. We need to be intentional about the affordable housing, about it being there, and not being off-site, because we want it to be inclusionary. Like, kids should be able to grow up in a beautiful place, whether they're of a low economic status or if their parents are wealthy. Like, how do we know that you guys are going to do that? And it seems like nobody's on the same page in here. And this is the last workshop, so I'm very concerned about what are you going to do now that we've voiced our concerns, and this is the last workshop. How will you actually do the things that we're asking, and how do we know? Like, are you guys going to try to do another one? Maybe you guys should add on a couple more. This seems kind of rushed. So, how would you address that?
Things are definitely moving quickly. The framework that we're going to provide is going to be about open space. It's going to be about inclusionary, and it's going to be the guidance that your council will, in theory, will buy into, will approve, will adopt, and will use to guide and to judge what a developer comes back with. We need to capture that accurately. The vision plan does not say developer build this. The vision plan will say, this could be an outcome, and here's some of the things that seem to resonate, and here's perhaps some areas that it didn't resonate within the community discussion, so that it informs your council and that it informs a development group that would be proposing on this property, and give them some of those parameters. But again, it's the framework that is the useful guide. These are our testing of what that framework could start to look like. A developer would come back with their own version of this. But so again, it's that framework that becomes really important, and we want to have a framework related. I'm hearing we need a framework related to inclusionary housing on this property. So this is the last public workshop associated with this process. It will go to Planning Commission for presentation and public comment later this month. And then it'll come to your city council. I forgot we're in August. Later September, towards the end of September, that's the Planning Commission, City Council, mid-October.
Okay. I'm going to take one question here and then coming over to that side and then back here.
Couple of questions. I appreciate the fact that you've given everybody the best answers that you can, but I think this whole thing was based on a wrong premise. It was not a court order. It was a negotiated settlement, and the fact of the matter is that I believe it's state law that the developer picks whether or not there's affordable housing on-site or off-site. Remember, there's something called the Palmer decision, and I believe that would prevail, but you should check that out. Secondly, you haven't talked about developers' density bonuses, nor have you talked about levels of affordability. There's low income, very low income, and then there's moderate income. And most developers recently are selecting moderate income and mixing it in with luxury. But you need to check that one out. You also need to check out whether or not you can jam housing in a historic district, because the California Historic District and the Federal Historic District is going to have to okay what you put on that site, because if it affects the adaptive reuse of the historic site, you can't build what you want to build on there. So there are a lot of ifs, ands, or buts behind all of these proposals. I do want to make some statement about the drum lot. It should not have housing. It should have recreational uses. That's what makes it feasible. The playing fields, and when you talk about, and Mr. Mitchell talked about it earlier on, about the meeting at the in Yosemite, the Ahwahnee principles state very clearly that open space and parks are equally important in the design of a city. You cannot neglect that. Richmond is park poor. It does not have enough playing fields, soccer lots, baseball lots, and that kind of thing. And once you let that opportunity go, you will never get it back. It'll be gone forever. And kids need that. They need that in their development, and study after study shows that it produces healthier kids, healthier families, healthier populations. And that's what the city of Richmond should be reaching for.
Great points. Thank you.
I'd like to address one of the sort of driving forces of the design. Up until tonight, the figure I saw most often for the number of residential units was 670. And all of a sudden, I'm seeing 670 to 1,100. And that's kind of a big gap. And so I'd like to know what kinds of feedback you've gotten from community members, not from city employees or management, but what kinds of pushes have you gotten from people in the community that would push this higher than 670?
Thank you for the question. The 670 comes from the judgment, settlement agreement, whatever we want to call it. That's the number that was in there. The EIR for the casino development looked at a number up to 1,100. If you read the language of the judgment, it says a minimum of 670. So it's prudent for this process just to begin to test within that range to be able to figure out sort of what fits and what the trade-offs might be. And so the feedback related to the question is, what feedback have we heard related to the number 670 or related to any of these numbers? And certainly, I think it's safe to say we've heard a lot of feedback, no housing, right? There's many of you in the room say no housing. We've also heard, just want to be fair and acknowledge, we've also heard locate majority of the housing or locate the housing in the Winehaven district. We've also heard, yeah, put housing on the site, make it inclusive. We've certainly heard that range. I haven't heard anybody say we want 1,100 units. That's not something that we're hearing, but it's out here, and these numbers are available for you all. These numbers are available for you all to comment on. What we've tested is to get a sense of what does that start to look like. And I think that's a really important step tonight.
I attended a couple of meetings. Is this working? I attended a couple of meetings, a meeting that the city put on in March of 2016 where 5 companies presented proposals for how to develop Point Molate. And I don't retain everything, but I do recall 2 things specifically related to this. One was that the cottages are so toxic that it would be definitely cost ineffective to try to have them persist, or it'd be much cheaper to tear them down and build up facsimiles. The second thing was, especially in the 5th presentation that day, it was clear from other things said that the open space would be handled by various park agencies, especially the Regional Park District. Trust for Public Land and other things were suggested as other sources for funds. The Park District, according to that, I believe the 5th presenter said, if there were housing on what you're defining as the drum lot that was behind the beach, they would not consider taking it on because that would amount to privatizing the beach in preference for the housing that is there. I do not know if either of these points is something that you consider still valid, but I would be interested in your addressing them.
Sure. Thank you for raising those questions. At our last workshop, East Bay Regional Park District, TPL, National Park Service, Coastal Conservancy were in attendance. We've had additional conversations with East Bay Regional Park District in particular. They're very interested in some alignment between the open space and the trails and the beach park here and their mission. They see themselves as partners, but they don't see themselves as galloping in on a white horse with a big bag of money. They've been actually very cautious about that. They haven't said to us that they could not proceed with a relationship if there was housing on the drum lot. We haven't heard that. We haven't heard that expressed. In relation to the cottages, they're part of the historic district. They would cost a whole lot of money to fix up. There's all the things that you mentioned associated with them. What was tested tonight really did look at rehabbing those buildings, but I think we're also listening to see, is there a greater range out there that says, yeah, tear some of them down and use those footprints for new uses. I think we're open to hearing that.
Hi, thank you. My name is Michael Glickson. I want to speak to the affordability, the affordable nature of the housing. Felicia presented economic possibilities that basically these districts foreclosed there being an affordable component because you couldn't form the district with that kind of idea. So I'm not sure if that's true, but okay, so that's not true. So the affordability, there was mentioned that without public transportation, it's hard to finance affordable housing. I worked in affordable housing for 9 years at one of our local developers, and transit-oriented development and the scores that are created to get low-income housing tax credits to finance affordable housing require grocery stores nearby and transportation nearby. So it just, I don't see how this is going to work. I don't see how it's going to pencil out. And it seems like what's most likely going to happen is in lieu fees are going to be paid. And it's not going to be inclusionary housing here. I'd like a response.
Those were your statements. I think Felicia spoke about how the financing districts are created. I think she could weigh into that a little bit more. I think there is a great challenge ahead, and I think it really fundamentally goes back to one of the tables where I was talking with folks at the last workshop, which is in a affordable, a population that uses affordable housing might have an increased need for services. They have different needs for access. So those issues really have to be addressed in the context of affordability and in the context of an inclusionary housing approach. Those two things have to go hand in hand. And so I think the issues you're raising, are absolutely right. Whether that's insurmountable to the plan, I can't speculate on that. I'll let others close that door. I tend to be the optimist to say that there are some new models, there are some interesting ways to do this, and this would be a really interesting place to live and to raise your children if you can solve the schools. But daycare services, an inclusionary neighborhood, co-housing where we rely on other members of our community and we're not necessarily relying in these other ways. I think there are some creative models and ideas out there. I'd like to hear more of those ideas as part of this process. Poonam, next speaker.
Yeah, I want to continue a little bit with the numbers. Some years ago, I was on one of the community advisory groups for Contra Costa County Transit Authority, and this was during the recession, and we were looking, and one of the things that they constantly look at there is the nexus between getting money, sales tax monies being returned to the cities for road improvements versus building housing. particularly affordable housing. And the affordable housing part of it back 4 years ago or so was ZIP. And when asking, well, how much would it cost to do affordable housing? And I was told, this is 4 or 5 years ago, no, 4 years ago, $350,000 a unit. So to put that into perspective, the house that I moved into in 2001, whose sale price doubled in the 5 years before we moved into it, $355,000. This just absolutely blew me away. So now, given all of the conditions that have to be applied to this site, everybody's been talking about, what would affordable housing cost on this site to build?
I certainly don't have any answers to that kind of question. I'm 84 years old. I have lifelong friends who live in Richmond. They wouldn't get on BART these days. Richmond has a transit system. They've got Uber and Lyft and Go Granny on their phones, and that's how they get around, and I'm liking to think that a lot more people would do that too.
This, I'm absolutely, completely unclear about how what Richmond wants to do can work. You know, the financing, sounds like a chicken and egg situation. The vision, also, I just, you know, I hear what the community is saying. Mr. Mitchell has some wonderful ideas about how communities can be created to support, so the people can support each other within the community. That sounds wonderful. However, I also hear that the developer will come up with the ideas. So I'm confused. I am 100% confused.
The developer comes up with the dollars and the cents to achieve the balanced vision, and therein certainly lies that really is the uncertainty that you're seeing here. And I think it's real uncertainty because there's just a lot of questions about what's really going to be feasible and what would a master developer come back with. But what we have to have in place is what is the vision that would anchor what's most important to this community, and to give sort of benchmarks associated with where the community's values are, so that whatever that entity can come back with can try to best achieve those things. That would be the best case scenario.
I think you guys did a wonderful job trying to formulate all of that. It just doesn't seem to add up, that's all.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Hi, this is Evan from the RCDE again, and I work with my colleagues Sasha and Tanya. I just want to raise a couple quick points that came up in our meeting last night. There was a lot of focus on youth spaces, and so in Richmond currently, that means predominantly Black and Latino spaces, Southeast Asian spaces, right? And so if we make quote-unquote universal youth spaces, what does that look like, right? How do those spaces become anchor spaces where Richmond youth who are here today actually want to go and use those spaces, right? So if anyone works at Rise Youth Center, which I have, right, you know that only certain kids come, young people come from certain parts of the city to be in those spaces, right? So when we're talking about the city going out and using that space, how are we being really intentional about that, and how can we put that in some of these documents, right? So that's not just universal hospitality space. What does that mean? How does that really look like Richmond? How does that really become accessible to people in Richmond? And that needs to be written into these visioning documents, right? And how do we actually have that pulled in? The second thing I want to say is that There's been comments on this is great, that this has been a very engaged process. And I just have to say that's because Richmond is a really organized community. It's not because this process has been inclusive. And I'm sorry, but I just have to say that, right? This is a replication of traditional planning practices, right, that have replicated a kind of consolidating of wealth in the hands of developers, the already wealthy, people who have friends in high places, that type of thing. We don't see any shift in ownership. We don't see any vision about how to build real equity in Richmond in this project. We're talking about tax base, that's it. Right? So what is the real vision that we could possibly have here? How do we share ownership in this model? There's no minimum sale value on this land. We've been like, kind of strong-armed into this 50-50 deal. Sell it for $1, then what happens? Right? How does we shift ownership on that? What's the real vision? And we look at the kind of historical racism that exists in a place, right, like Richmond through residential segregation. We're not even talking about that. That doesn't even come up in this conversation. So I just want to share that for you, for WRT, who has a $250,000 contract on this project, we are replicating the structures that create inequity in this country and in this society. So I just want to share that as part of this process. Thank you.
Thanks for your guys' work and your meetings, and I do want you to contribute not just tonight and in these meetings, but through the other means, and be as direct as you can, so that we can include that sort of comments and direction into the vision.
As a comment, one of your contacts be on the list. I know it's Lena, and I know Lena, so I have to go through Lena to kind of get anybody from WRT. So for that.
Yeah, I can give you my contact information, but also the website comes directly into us as well. Thank you.
My name is Tay. I'm from the organization Rich City Rise. I'm also the co-owner of the bike shop that's on the corner of McDonald and 1500 block. And I'm in the core of Richmond. I believe that we are all one Richmond. And I don't hear that in this conversation. I'm kind of disappointed in, I'm not gonna say everybody, but a lot of people had no conversation about bringing us all together. There's a Point Richmond, there's a Marina Bay, there's a South Richmond, there's a annex. Like, we are all one Richmond. And if we got a shot, it's kind of like this is our shot to actually bring us all together. And I don't hear that in this conversation. And another thing I'm kind of disappointed about, I'm one of the youngsters. I'm 35, but I'm still one of the youngsters that's on the streets. I'm talking to the youngsters. I've done petitions. Me and my team have done petitions and talked to the youth, their parents, and we have got those signed. And I don't see any of them in these types of meetings. I only have this type of voice, but I mean, I'm pretty sure I'm in a room full of experts that know how to rally people up. And all I see is, and all I hear is kind of a borderline selfish type of situation that could go on right here. And my kids that are 8 through 12, and I would like them to want to go here. And if I had a choice, it would be no housing. Do something with the housing that's already in Richmond, and people that's holding their properties hostage and not giving them to anybody to live in. They got the rent skyrocketed for no reason, just doubling up on on their payments, and their property levels are so low, on their property costs are so low. It's a lot of things to be considered, and this whole thing was rushed. I was a part of every meeting, and I still don't feel like me and the people that I've talked to that come in my bike shop every day that actually ride the Richmond streets have anywhere to go or even know about this. I'm the only one, and my team the only one that actually been telling people about this. So where are my elders? Where are my Richmond elders that actually want this for their grandkids? Where are your grandkids at? Where are your nieces, your nephews, and stuff like that live in this city? That's actually going to benefit from stuff like this. Unity Park, we got a bunch of examples. We got Dirt World, right? We got Kennedy Park. We got a bunch of examples on how the core of Richmond, we are one Richmond, is representing each other, and not being selfish, is being all for one. I don't see this, and this is really unfair. That if y'all do any of this type of stuff without, my petition said that everybody wanted a campsite. My petition said it wanted less development as possible, let people in, unlock the gates, and let us ride with our bicycles. My petition said that elder people wanted pedicabs to carry them over there. How? I don't hear any of this. I just hear a bunch of, I hear, not all, but most of a lot of selfish people.
You.
Well, I'm happy to follow somebody, but that was pretty eloquent, I have to say. So I think one of the premises here, and I participated in a number of these, and frankly, I don't get from the sessions I participated in the conclusions you guys are drawing. I mean, for one thing, it's pretty clear that there's a strong feeling that housing should be put downtown where we have the infrastructure and where it's needed, and improve the housing stock and revitalize the downtown and do something to protect the people, make downtown a vibrant place for Richmond. Second part, the cost of bringing all the infrastructure out there is prohibitive. And so that makes it almost impossible to do this without making it high-income housing. And that's what's going to happen. You know, there was a conversation that, well, we've talked to Caltrans, and Caltrans is working on creating a solution. Caltrans has been working on creating a solution, and we know what we have. It can't do it, not without massive infrastructure changes. And it's not going to happen. I know they're going to make their promises that they'll make it better, but we all know that the Richmond Bridge is going to be worse and worse and worse. And if there, God forbid, were a fire or some kind of an explosion at Chevron, all those 1,100 homes would have to get out of there, and they're not going to be able to do it by ferry. They're going to be stuck. And there's no consideration of that in any of this. What there could be consideration, though, instead of talking about, well, we'll try to figure out to shoehorn in some moderate income or maybe low income housing or affordable housing, a better equity position is to view this as it came from the federal government to us. It's public land, and it's a great opportunity to keep this as a park for everybody, so that it's open. You put in playing fields on the drum lots, like most of those things seem to indicate. Most of those plans talk about playing fields on the drum lots, not housing. And I know that one of those plans had a lot of housing, like 800, but it happened to be the plan that Mayor Butt's son and his friends, that table they sat at. We know the mayor wants a bunch of development. We know the mayor was negotiating at this lawsuit with the developers to come up with a plan that gave them a bunch of development and split the profit 50-50. I'm not saying the mayor's a bad guy. I just think he has a bad idea. So I think that what we really want to hear is try to maximize the infrastructure that we have and to figure out a way to do that. Now, about the lawsuit, it is a current settlement of a lawsuit that's now under review and being challenged in court. And so it is a risky thing to do, to make a whole bunch of plans on a lawsuit that may be thrown out, and a settlement agreement that may be thrown out, and you may be back to where you need to be to have the community involved. And as to a process, I've watched the outreach that was done on this, and when you really want to reach people, you put the effort into it. That didn't happen here. I'm not blaming you guys, the consultants, but all I can say is there was a very poor effort. And the city council, they said they wanted 2,500 participants to know that they had spoken to enough community members in Richmond, and maybe you guys reached about 300 people. So there's no rush. Nothing's going to happen tomorrow or within the next year that Richmond can't come together and plan this right. Why be bums rushed into planning? These are the plans the mayor had in his head before we started all this. We arrived at where he wanted us to be and didn't really include the public. That's what happened here. So I'm not blaming you. You guys had a job. You were hired, you guys were hired to do this as consultants, and I think that you've tried to do some good things with it, but the reality is that this is not the best plan for Richmond, that the community can come together and come up with their own best plan, and that the mayor and the city council should be open to that kind of input. So I think you guys swing and a miss here. I don't think you did it.
Thank you. This plan is the direction of your city council. and the city council approved and gave the direction here. So I just want to make sure that's clear.
Hi, my name's Greg. One comment to what you said. With only one road in and out of that property, you're crazy to develop it. You're surrounded by fuel tanks. Why can't you put in a north access road? I mean, the Chevron property ends at some point.
There is no northern access road that doesn't go through the bay or Chevron, so it would be
then you got to work
ferry
with Chevron
and
because
these sorts of things.
To develop that place to this size with only one entrance and exit, I'm sorry, it's a disaster waiting to happen.
Thank you. We had the fire marshal earlier tonight. Let's do 2 more questions.
I'm new to the process, but I didn't hear any discussion of sea level rise and what impact that's going to have on a site like this. Can you?
Yeah, the mapping indicates that actually largely the site is above the projected flood elevations. Really, it's the beach park area that's probably most impacted just due to potential erosion, and it's the effect of erosion that we're already seeing both from drainage coming down off the road and over the bluff, as well as undercutting by wave action. And so that's really the focus of a different project, which is adding riprap and protecting that shoreline area. Fortunately, the areas like at the Point and the Winehaven buildings themselves are actually outside of a sea level rise projection, which is good news for the site, good news for the property.
How you doing? I work with the Native American Health Center, literally like 2 buildings down. I just want to know what the city is doing to prioritize the protection of sacred sites. What are the efforts to reach out to local tribes about the areas that are designated for development with no understanding or even thought to what's going to be the process to when you uncover bodies like native ancestral lands, and you say that the federal government gave this land back to the city, but this is all native land. So when you say that this is all planned for development, what is going to happen when you uncover bodies of native people, ancestors who were here thousands of years before the federal government, before the city of Richmond?
You're raising 2 levels of comment and question, and I'm going to answer the very technical one because that's the one that I really can. The Native American sites in terms of archaeological cultural resources are really well mapped and documented out there. There's an understanding of where those are and where if you were to go in and dig, you would be impacting something. And so those are very much set aside. Those aren't publicly mapped because that's just the culture of how you do it, so that information isn't out there so somebody doesn't then go and desecrate a site. So we've respected that within the context of this work. That's really important. During construction, in terms of digging, there's a whole host of protocols and procedures that go into place if something is discovered where construction stops and those sorts of things can occur. So I'm not addressing the higher level issue of ownership. I'm not going to go to that one. That was your first part of your question. To reach out? Is there specific? I'm going to ask the city because that's not something that I know. Has there been any particular outreach to tribes related to Point Molate that you're aware of?
Nothing specific as part of this process. As part of the previous casino project, we did consult with the Native American Heritage Commission and provided a list and information regarding our planning efforts, our environmental document. And so in that process, we received a lot of information. and that information was shared with the consultant team in terms of areas to avoid, areas where there were known archaeological resources. So however, when we redo the zoning associated with this land use visioning, consultation will be reinitiated.
Great. Poonam, any other questions? We have one more. We have one more here, and then I think we're going to have a wrap.
Yeah, the question becomes, maybe just the comment about, again, the outreach thing, which Tay and Robert both addressed. Sure, there are differences, but when they did the Albany Beach and the Albany Bulb, they managed to actually get 10% of the population out at maybe 250 unique individuals in a city with 104,000 people. That's a really, we see the divisions that seem to be kind of ossified in Richmond. I'm one of the people who kind of bounces in between these various communities, in spite of my skin color and age. I really haven't seen, really have not in my lifetime won out over racism works. It works very well for the elite in this country. The particular question is deal with the economics. Well, we've talked about we're going to get a developer in, and other people have hinted at liabilities for the community at large. Well, if you get a developer in, and we live in a bubble economy, that's kind of what I was hinting at earlier when I was talking about what happened to the house that I live in, and seeing houses around the corner now selling for $700,000 that aren't much different than mine. What happens if the developer goes bust because we have another bust like we had in 07, 08? Where does that leave the city? What kind of safeguards does the city have to insulate itself from not getting what happens, say, to Vallejo, to throw out an example?
So I think in terms of the terms of any development agreement or negotiated agreement with the developers, unknown yet, because we haven't actually received specific proposals. Now, the judgment does specify certain outcomes if we don't provide discretionary approvals by April 2020 and sell the property by April 2022. So, if we don't complete the visioning process and select a master developer and issue discretionary approvals.
That's not the question. What does the city do to insulate itself from liability if, and very, very, very possible, it blows up?
So that would be part of a land disposition agreement that we would execute with the developer. Now, I don't know if we would be able to achieve 100% safeguards given economies, but obviously making sure we have a qualified developer and one with resources available to achieve the project within the specified, having the expertise that we need to complete. So, those are all things that need to continue to be negotiated and looked at as we move forward. So I think with that, we've taken the last question, and we really thank you all for participating and providing your input, and look forward to additional comments online. Our website is still active until September 8th in terms of the activity that's online now. So just thank you all and have a good evening. Thank you. Drive safely or ride safely.